snow. Wind, hoofbeats swallowed by a white, howling void. The Vanderlinda gang rides single file through the storm above Coulter, lanterns flickering against the dark, the last ghosts of a dying frontier pushing into the teeth of extinction. Behind them, Blackwater burns in memory. Ahead of them, there is nothing but cold, hunger, and the faint echo of a promise called freedom. This is not just a band of outlaws escaping a botched robbery. It is a story of a world tearing itself apart and pretending it still makes sense. Men and women clinging to ideals as the world was changing without their consent. In that blizzard, the gang becomes a moving funeral procession for the American West itself, riding between idealism and reality, between freedom and civilization, between loyalty and betrayal. At the center of that procession rides Dutch Vanderlinde, hat low, coat flapping, eyes fixed on a horizon no one else can see. To the Pinkertons, he is a terrorist. To the newspapers, a monster. But in the truest sense, Dutch is something far more dangerous, a charismatic revolutionary, a father figure, and a lost soul who believes his own philosophy even as it destroys everything around him. Dutch speaks of a world where decent people can live free of government, of railroads, of bankers and barons and laws written for the rich. His words turn robbery into resistance, crime into a cause. He gathers the broken and the unwanted and calls them family. Runaways, orphans, abused women, disillusioned men, all drawn into his orbit because he tells them they matter, that their suffering has meaning, that together they can build something better in the wilderness. Is it conviction, or is it a con he has started to believe himself? From its humble beginnings in the 1870s, that family grows in the shadow of the Civil War's aftermath. The Union may have won, but the peace is uneven and cruel. The old ways were dying, but nothing kinder replaces them. Industrialization surges forward, the railroads carve the land, and the federal government stretches its reach through Pinkertons, soldiers, and judges. In that gap between promise and reality, Dutch's gang becomes the living embodiment of America's contradictions, born from oppression, preaching freedom, sustained by violence. Between the 1870s and the early 1900s, their camps trace the country's transformation. From backwoods hideouts and easy scores to Blackwater's failed ferry job, to St. Denis' choking smoke and electric lights. Every move forces Dutch's ideals to collide with an encroaching civilization that will not yield. As the pressure mounts, his mind becomes the battlefield where all of these forces meet. Dreams against delusions, loyalty against betrayal, a father's love against a leader's pride. This is their complete story, from the first meeting of two conmen in a train station to the final bullets on snowy mountains and sun-bleached mesas. From Dutch's earliest ideals to his last step off a cliff. How does a man who fights for freedom become a paranoid cult leader? How does a gang that begins as a family end as a legend, a warning, and a question mark over America itself? To answer that, the story must return to the very beginning. To answer that, this will unfold as a complete saga, a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, traced step by step across decades. Not a highlight reel, not a handful of famous missions, but the full arc, every key camp, every major heist, every fracture in the Vanderlinda family as Dutch's mind slowly turns against itself. From its humble beginnings in the 1870s, the narrative will move through Dutch's shadowy formative years, when the world was changing and the old ways were dying. A brutal father, a drifting mother, early encounters with preachers and sheriffs who preached morality while dealing in cruelty. These are the seeds of his hatred for government and civilization. In the truest sense, Dutch is forged long before the player ever meets him, and those early wounds will echo in every speech, every plan, every execution order he gives. The time span is vast. The story will follow Dutch and Hosea as they meet as rival conmen in the late 1870s, two men who both try to rob each other and end up laughing instead of shooting. From there, the 1880s and 1890s become the age of expansion, the recruitment of Arthur Morgan as a boy, then John Marston, the slow gathering of misfits and runaways into something that calls itself a family. Camps in the Grizzlies, in the Heartlands, in Lemoyne, feuds with the O'Driscolls, with rich plantation families, with lawmen and Pinkertons who refuse to let the gang remain ghosts. Every major heist will matter. The early Robin Hood robberies that target the rich and corrupt, the Blackwater ferry disaster that shatters the illusion of invincibility, the St. Denis bank job that kills Hosea and Lenny and tears the gang's sanity in half. Each will be treated not only as lore, but as a psychological case study, what Dutch tells his people before the job, how he explains the blood afterward, how he rewrites failure into betrayal rather than admit his own mistakes. The structure will be clear. Origins of Dutch and Hosea, the adoption of Arthur and John. The period of growth where the gang becomes the living embodiment of Dutch's philosophy of freedom, roaming from camp to camp as if civilization can be outrun. Then, the internal fractures, Bill's insecurity, Javier's loyalty, Micah's poison, Arthur's awakening, John's disillusionment. Finally, the catastrophic collapse at Beaver Hollow and the long shadow stretching into the Red Dead Redemption era, where Dutch repeats his patterns with new followers on new mountains. Throughout, the narrative will weave together in game events, implied backstory, and thematic analysis of Dutch's mind. Every relationship will reveal another angle of that mind, Hosea as his conscience, Arthur as his lost soul of a son, John as the heir who refuses the crown, Micah as the mirror of his worst impulses. This is not only a history of an outlaw gang, it is a psychological autopsy. And the beginning? It will not be a robbery, or a shootout on a snow-covered pass. It will be something quieter and far more disarming, a young drifter on a train platform, a silver-tongued stranger, and a conversation that changes the fate of the West. The story does not open with a hail of bullets. It opens with a misunderstanding, a shared target, and two men who both assume they are the only wolf in the room. Dutch Vanderlinde is young, sharp, and already rehearsing the speeches that will one day intoxicate an entire camp. On a dusty main street in the 1870s, he spots a plump railroad investor stepping out of a carriage, a walking ledger of other people's money wrapped in an expensive coat. Dutch's plan is simple: a staged accident, a helping hand, a quick dip into the man's pockets. It is, in the truest sense, a small rehearsal for a much larger performance. What Dutch does not see, at least not at first, is the other predator watching the same man. Hosea Matthews leans against a post, eyes half-lidded, taking everything in. Where Dutch burns, Hosea observes. He has already studied the investor's gait, the way he protects his left pocket, the nervous glances toward the sheriff's office. Hosea's plan is quieter, a forged opportunity, a fake investment, a few signatures, and the rich fool walks away poorer without ever knowing he has been robbed. Both men move at once. Dutch barrels forward with theatrical concern as the investor trips over his outstretched boot. Hosea appears from the other side with a gentleman's smile and a reassuring arm. For a brief, absurd moment, the wealthy man is cradled between two outlaws, who are each trying to pick a different pocket while selling a different lie. It is a meet-cute written in larceny. The double cross reveals itself in the smallest motions, Dutch's hand colliding with Hosea's eyes flashing in irritation, the investor's growing suspicion. The moment could turn bloody. Dutch's temper flares, Hosea's fingers brush the grip of his pistol, and the mark stammers in confusion. Then it happens. The investor flees, coat flapping, money miraculously intact, both cons ruined, both predators empty-handed, silence hangs for a heartbeat. Then Dutch laughs. It is not polite laughter. It is a deep, delighted roar at the sheer ridiculousness of it all. Hosea, against his better judgment, joins in. Here, from its humble beginnings as a failed robbery, the partnership is born, not in success, but in mutual recognition. Each has just met a mind as quick, a hand as bold, a tongue as silver as his own. Early sketches of character are already clear. Dutch is charming and theatrical, turning a botched con into a grand tale within minutes, spinning a philosophy about how men the world over are parasites on honest labor, and how their kind merely reclaims what civilization has stolen. Hosea is wry and pragmatic, amused but unconvinced, seeing that Dutch believes his own rhetoric more than the facts warrant. In that instant, Hosea reads Dutch better than Dutch reads himself. Conflict becomes camaraderie over a bottle in a dim saloon. They compare tricks, trade stories, test each other's lies. By night's end, a decision has been made. Together, they are more dangerous, more flexible, more free. This is more than a partnership. It is the seed of a philosophy about chosen family, about building a world on the margins where lost soul after lost soul can belong. Yet within that first shared joke lies a shadow, The same bond that creates the gang, that turns two rivals into brothers, will one day become the fault line that tears everything apart. When loyalty hardens into delusion, when laughter gives way to suspicion, what happens to a story of freedom and family then? The answer begins with the next person they take in. The answer begins with Dutch himself, because from the very beginning the gang is an extension of his mind. Before the speeches, before the grand plans, there is a boy growing up poor, beaten down by a father who drank in a world that never cared. Dutch's hatred of government and institutions is not abstract philosophy. It is a scar. The state, the church, the banks, to him they are just different faces of the same indifferent cruelty. In a world where the old ways were dying and railroads carved up the horizon, Dutch decided that freedom was not a privilege to be granted, but a moral right to be taken. He read radical tracts, quoted poets he half understood, and stitched their words into a story of resistance. To Dutch, the outlaw was not just a criminal. He was a folk hero, the living embodiment of defiance against a civilization built on exploitation. Robbing a train was not theft. It was a sermon preached with dynamite. But this is also a story of two men. Where Dutch saw revolution, Hosea Matthews saw survival. Hosea had known hunger, prisons, and the quiet humiliation of begging for work from men who would never respect him. Crime to Hosea was a craft, a trade, something to be done cleanly, cleverly, and with as little blood as possible. He did not dream of overthrowing the world. He wanted to outwit it, to slip through its fingers and live well on the margins. Together, their philosophies formed a strange balance. Dutch reached upward, forever chasing ideals and dreams of a better world just over the next hill. Hosea reached downward, grounding those dreams in careful planning, scouting, and restraint. When Dutch's rhetoric soared too high, promising one last score that would change everything, Hosea was the one who quietly shortened the fuse. He believed in the family they were building, but he also understood how quickly idealism could become delusion. From its humble beginnings, the Vanderlinda gang became part criminal enterprise, part utopian experiment. A roaming commune of misfits, it gathered runaways, orphans, abused women, disillusioned men, anyone the new America had no place for. Around the campfire there was food, laughter, and a sense of dignity. For a drifter or a lost soul, this was freedom in the truest sense. No bosses, no landlords, only the shared belief that together they could stay one step ahead of civilization. To hold this fragile world together, Dutch and Hosea shaped a flexible code of honor. They would target the rich and the corrupt when they could, the rail barons, the plantation families, the bankers who locked power behind iron doors. They avoided needless cruelty, at least in principle, and justified their violence as resistance against a rigged system. Were they thieves, or were they rebels? The answer changed with the audience, and with Dutch's mood. Yet within that code lay the seed of a fatal contradiction. Dutch preached freedom and equality, but he also needed control, over the plans, over the money, over the hearts of his people. Hosea, acting as his conscience, could nudge him back from the brink, but that role was both vital and fragile. What happens when the man who claims to fight tyranny begins to resemble the very forces he hates? The next years of the gang's story will answer that, one escalating decision at a time. That question hangs over the gang's future, but in the meantime Dutch and Hosea set about proving that their answer to tyranny is not just a philosophy, but a family. From its humble beginnings as two conmen and a teenage boy, the Vanderlinda gang becomes a moving refuge for the rejected, the desperate, the lost soul with nowhere else to go. They do not recruit in the usual outlaw sense. Dutch and Hosea begin seeking out runaways, orphans, abused women, and disillusioned men, not merely as extra guns, but as people to rescue and reshape. A beaten woman hiding from a drunk husband, a veteran discarded by the government he bled for, a street thief on the edge of the noose, these are not accidents. Dutch looks at each of them and sees raw material for his dream, a story of redemption through rebellion. This is where Dutch's savior complex hardens into habit. He offers more than food and safety. He offers identity. Around the fire, beneath the trees, he tells them that civilization has failed them, that the world was changing and leaving honest folk behind, that they are better than the bankers, the railroad men, the politicians who cast them out. Struggling between freedom and civilization, he insists they are the living embodiment of a purer America, an America where the old ways were dying, but did not have to die quietly. Early camp life reflects that idealistic promise. Shared meals scraped from successful hunts, stories traded under the stars, laughter in the dark between jobs, it feels, in the truest sense, like home. Dutch stands to give speeches about freedom, about loyalty, about standing together against betrayal and greed. Hosea, less theatrical, moves through the background, teaching people to shoot straight, to ride, to read a trail, to count the money and not get cheated. One man builds the dream, the other makes sure it can eat. Over time, this pattern creates something deeper and more dangerous than simple camaraderie. For many, the gang becomes the only stable home they have ever known, the first place their name is spoken with respect instead of contempt. Where else can an outlaw be praised as principled, a killer be framed as a protector? Dutch's approval becomes oxygen. A nod from him can erase a lifetime of shame, while a frown can feel like exile back into a hostile world. And here, beneath the campfire warmth, the trap takes shape. Rescue leads to dependence, dependence hardens into loyalty, and loyalty blinds people to warning signs. What happens when the man who saved everyone begins to lose himself? When the dream curdles, many will discover that escaping Dutch's world is far harder than entering it, a truth the gang will confront as the plans grow darker and the bodies begin to fall. Rescue, dependence, loyalty, for Dutch, this pattern becomes a method, a philosophy, almost a ritual. And the clearest example of that ritual in the truest sense is the boy he pulls out of the dirt and reshapes into his living embodiment of the dream, Arthur Morgan. Arthur's story begins before the gang, before the speeches, with a small, ugly tragedy on the fringes of civilization. Born to Lyle Morgan, a petty criminal drifting through saloons and back alleys, Arthur grows up watching his father fail at everything except getting into trouble. There is no stable home, no real family, only a boy trailing behind a man who keeps promising that the next town will be better. It never is. When Lyle is finally arrested and hanged, the law calls it justice. But for Arthur, it feels like the world was changing without warning, ripping away the only constant he had, however flawed. He is still just a teenager when that rope snaps his childhood in half. What follows is not redemption, but survival. Arthur turns to theft almost by instinct, stealing food, snatching purses, running from sheriffs who see only another outlaw in the making. He becomes half feral on the road, angry at the world, directionless and alone. Yet even then, under the grime and resentment, there is a sharp mind paying attention, a boy who reads people, who understands risk, who refuses to simply lie down and die. That is the Arthur Dutch and Hosea ride upon, a lost soul crouched behind a rock, waiting to rob the very men who are about to change his life. The irony is almost theatrical. Two conmen who once tried to rob each other now stumble onto a teenager trying to rob them. Guns are drawn, tempers flare, and then, in a moment that will echo for decades, Dutch sees something familiar in Arthur's eyes. Not just desperation, but potential. Intelligence, hurt, Hosea, ever the pragmatist, sees it too. From that encounter onward, Arthur's world is rebuilt under a new banner. Dutch takes charge of the boy's mind. He teaches him to read, to argue, to see their crimes not as random thefts, but as part of a grand story of freedom and resistance. Dutch talks about the old ways were dying, about civilization crushing the weak, about their gang as a family standing against a rigged world. Arthur listens. He believes. Dutch becomes more than a leader. He becomes a father in everything but blood. Hosea completes the education. Where Dutch spins philosophy, Hosea offers craft. He shows Arthur how to pick pockets in a crowded street without a whisper of suspicion, how to scout a town, how to track a deer through snow and a bounty hunter through the brush. Dutch gives Arthur dreams. Hosea makes sure he lives long enough to chase them. In this balance, Arthur becomes Dutch's proof of concept. From its humble beginnings, the gang can point to him and say, "This is what the Vanderlinda way can do." A broken boy, reshaped into a loyal, capable outlaw with a purpose beyond his own hunger. Dutch sees Arthur as a son, but also as validation. If Arthur thrives, then Dutch's philosophy must be right, must be necessary, must be noble. For Arthur, the devotion runs even deeper. Dutch is the man who stepped in when the world abandoned him, who turned chaos into meaning. In the very beginning, Arthur's faith in Dutch borders on religious. Doubt feels not just disloyal, but impossible. So what happens when that kind of belief meets the first real fracture? when the man who saved him starts to look different in the firelight, and the sermons about freedom no longer match the blood on the ground? Those questions are still distant on the horizon, but the first cracks are already waiting in Dutch's shadow. For Arthur, those cracks do not begin with open rebellion. They begin with imitation. From the very beginning of his life in the gang, he does not just follow Dutch, he absorbs him. In his journal, in the rough, careful handwriting of a man who was taught to read by an outlaw philosopher, Arthur repeats Dutch's language about honor, about freedom, about their way of life standing above common banditry. The pages become a mirror of Dutch's speeches. Robberies are not robberies, they are collections from a corrupt civilization. Killings are not killings, they are regrettable necessities in a war against a rigged world. Arthur writes that they are helping the poor, that they are different from the O'Driscolls, that Dutch is trying to do some good. It is a story of crime wrapped in conscience, of brutality dressed in idealistic prose. And every time Arthur puts those thoughts to paper, the identity Dutch offered him hardens into something permanent. This creates a loop that keeps Dutch's philosophy alive. When Arthur steps between Dutch and danger, when he rides into gunfire to pull a wounded gang member out, when he repeats Dutch's lines about one more big score or the world changing against us, Dutch hears his own beliefs echoed back in a younger voice. It is validation in the truest sense. If this hard, capable son believes, then Dutch cannot be wrong, can he? Each act of loyalty becomes proof that the dream is still pure, and each sacrifice Arthur makes wipes away, in Dutch's mind, the blood on their hands. Yet there is another teacher in this camp. Hosea's influence is quieter, almost invisible at first glance, but it runs just as deep. He is the one who mutters that a job is not worth doing if the risk is wrong. He is the one who pulls Arthur aside after a reckless shootout and says that living to fight another day is its own kind of honor. Hosea plans, doubts, walks away. He tells Arthur that the world was changing long before Dutch ever admitted it, that the old ways were dying whether they liked it or not. Those lessons plant seeds. Arthur learns to scout, to question information, to see when a mark is too dangerous. He starts to notice when Dutch ignores Hosea's cautions, and some part of him files it away. Not open dissent, just a quiet ledger of unease. In the camp's daily rhythm, Arthur becomes both enforcer and caretaker. Dutch delivers the sermons, Arthur makes them real. He collects debts, intimidates rivals, and brings in money, but he also hunts meat, reassures the frightened, and listens when the others confess their fears. In the eyes of the gang, Dutch is the vision, Hosea is the wisdom. But Arthur is the living embodiment of the life they are all clinging to. That is where the tragedy takes root. The more Arthur defines himself through Dutch's approval, the more every campfire story, every successful robbery, every shared victory binds his identity to this man's choices. When betrayal finally comes, it will not feel like a leader failing. It will feel like the ground giving way beneath him. And the seeds Hosea planted, the skepticism, the planning, the sense that walking away can be noble, are waiting for the moment when Dutch's plans stop matching Dutch's promises, and the true believer is forced to decide what freedom really means. But Dutch is not a man who can live with only one disciple. One true believer is never enough. As Arthur grows into the living embodiment of Dutch's ideals, the gang's self-appointed prophet begins searching, almost unconsciously, for another lost soul to save, another mirror to polish his own reflection. From its humble beginnings, the Vanderlinda gang has been a story of broken children gathered under a banner of freedom. John Marston fits that pattern with brutal precision. Orphaned before he could properly remember his parents, passed between indifferent relatives and harsh institutions, John's early world is defined by cold beds, locked doors, and the sting of the belt. The orphanages and reform homes that claim to protect him only grind him down, treating him as a problem to be contained rather than a boy to be raised. He runs. Again and again, he runs. Each escape ends the same way: hunger, cold, and the slow realization that the world is not waiting to be kind. Nearly starving, he turns to petty crime, stealing food, snatching coins, drifting toward the outlaw life not as rebellion, but as survival. Where Arthur's path to Dutch begins with a father already in that world, John's begins alone in the gutter, abandoned by both family and civilization. Dutch encounters him as a half-starved teenager, all sharp angles and watchful eyes, trying to rob the wrong man. There is a moment of situational irony here. a boy attempting to hold up the very outlaw who will claim to save him. Dutch sees through the bluff, sees the shaking hands, and sees, above all, potential, another stray. Another project, another chance to prove, in the truest sense, that his philosophy can turn suffering into strength. But John is not Arthur. Where Arthur from the very beginning leans into Dutch's orbit with a hungry eagerness, John hangs back. He has been beaten by too many wardens, lied to by too many adults promising better tomorrows. Grand speeches do not impress him. They sound too much like sermons heard through barred windows. Dutch's charm still works, but it takes longer. Trust has to be pried loose, not simply offered. So Dutch adjusts. To John, he does not present the gang as mere family of outlaws, but as a righteous rebellion against the very institutions that failed him. The orphanages, the lawmen, the judges who never saw a scared boy, only a future criminal. Dutch names them all as enemies. He turns John's private wounds into part of a grand narrative, a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of freedom stolen by a corrupt civilization. Yet something in John never fully surrenders. There is always a sliver of distance, a quiet skepticism that refuses to die, even as he finds love, home, and purpose under Dutch's banner. That tension will matter, because the world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch's need for absolute loyalty will one day collide head-on with John's hard-earned doubt. When that happens, which will prove stronger, the man who saved him, or the boy who learned not to believe? That collision between loyalty and doubt does not happen in a vacuum. It grows inside the gang's daily life, embodied in two men who walk the same road but in opposite directions, Arthur Morgan and John Marston. From the very beginning, Dutch casts Arthur as the dutiful eldest son. Arthur is the one who rides out in the snow, who takes the beatings, who enforces Dutch's rules when others complain. He is the living embodiment of Dutch's philosophy, made flesh, work hard, protect the family, trust the plan. John, arriving later and rougher, becomes something else entirely. He is the rebellious younger brother, the stray Dutch cannot quite tame, the reminder that freedom and obedience do not always share the same saddle. This difference turns into friction almost immediately. Arthur sees John as reckless, ungrateful, too willing to disappear when responsibility comes calling. John, in turn, watches Arthur excuse Dutch's temper, his failures, his growing cruelty, and calls it what it is, blind loyalty. Their arguments over missed jobs, over disappearing acts, over who is pulling their weight are never just about chores. They are a story of two interpretations of the same man, two responses to the same sermon. Dutch, ever the strategist of hearts, encourages both roles. With Arthur, he praises loyalty, discipline, the willingness to bleed for the cause. He tells Arthur he is his rock, his son, the man he can always rely on when the world is closing in. With John, Dutch shifts his tone. He romanticizes John's wildness, his temper, his criminal instincts, insisting that turning a lost soul into a good man proves the power of the gang's ideals. In the truest sense, he is running two experiments at once. Their quarrels over risk and responsibility become miniature trials of Dutch's philosophy. When Dutch proposes another grand plan, Arthur tends to argue about tactics, timing, the safety of the camp. John argues about the premise itself. Is this really about freedom, or is Dutch chasing dreams that have already died? When John questions the wisdom of Blackwater, of Saint Denis, of pushing deeper into danger as civilization tightens its grip, Arthur initially defends Dutch as a visionary forced into hard choices by a cruel world. Slowly, those debates take on a darker edge. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and what once sounded idealistic begins to sound delusional. Arthur asks how much they are willing to sacrifice for Dutch's next miracle. John asks who they are really saving. Each clash between them foreshadows a harsher judgment to come, when loyalty itself starts to look like betrayal of everything Dutch once claimed to stand for. One day, that quiet question, who truly understood Dutch, the believer or the doubter, will no longer be theoretical. It will ride with them into gunsmoke, into blood, into a final choice where only one version of Dutch can survive. That question does not ride alone. It rides with wagons. From its humble beginnings as a tight knot of riders sharing one fire, the Vanderlinda gang swells into a moving nation, a caravan of outlaws and families rolling across a continent that does not want them. What began as a few horses and a bedroll becomes a line of creaking wagons, canvas tents, cook fires, and crying children, inching from snowbound passes to green river valleys as the world was changing around them. The camps become their chapters. Coulter in the blizzard, Horseshoe Overlook above the Dakota, Clemens Point on the bayou, Shady Bell in the ruined plantation. Beaver Hollow in the rotten mud, each place promises a fresh start, a reset, a new chance to outrun civilization. Each forced move, driven by Pinkertons, rival gangs, or Dutch's own escalating plans, is a reminder that the old ways were dying and that the dream of permanent freedom was always on borrowed time. In this roaming community, Dutch thrives. He walks the circles of firelight at night, cloak flaring, voice rolling over the camp as he turns hardship into narrative, setbacks into sermons. He mediates disputes between drunk cowhands, comforts widows, tells Arthur and John that they are his sons in the truest sense, to the hungry and the hunted. He becomes the living embodiment of purpose, a man who can turn a robbery into a philosophy and a cold camp into a family. Hosea makes sure it all actually works. While Dutch paints visions of a better world, Hosea counts the ammunition, scouts the routes, weighs the risks. He chooses which town can be conned and which must be avoided, who can be bribed and who will never stop hunting them. If Dutch is the preacher, Hosea is the quartermaster, quietly ensuring that Dutch's grand speeches do not end with everyone starving in the wilderness. As the caravan rolls on, its legend rolls ahead of it. Tales of train robberies in the Grizzlies, stagecoach ambushes on lonely roads, and daring escapes from lawmen spread from saloon to saloon. Some tell it as a story of Robin Hood outlaws stealing from rail barons and plantation men, handing money to desperate farmers and freedmen. Others whisper a darker version, a gang that smiles, quotes freedom, and leaves corpses in ditches. Here the pattern interrupts. The gang is no longer just a band. It is a rumor, a threat, a promise, depending on who is listening. Folk heroes to some, prime targets to Pinkertons, bounty hunters, and ambitious sheriffs, they become both symbol and prize in a world eager to prove that civilization always wins. And with growth comes strain. Every new mouth to feed, every hanger-on drawn by Dutch's charisma, adds another soul he feels compelled to inspire, control, and justify. The more he talks, the more he must believe his own words. How long can one man carry a nation on his tongue before the weight cracks it? Those cracks are coming. In the next camp, in the next plan, in the next betrayal that Dutch will insist is loyalty by another name. Those cracks are coming, and around the campfire they can already be heard in the voices that gather there. Faces glow in the firelight, stories overlap with the hiss of fat in the pan, and Dutch moves through it all like a preacher, walking a moving congregation, measuring every wound, every need, every dream. Abigail Roberts arrives on the edges of that circle, not as family, but as labor. A young woman surviving through sex work around the gang, trading her body to men who talk about freedom while handing over crumpled bills. She is both inside and outside their world. Dutch does not recruit her with speeches at first. He simply allows her to linger, to sleep near the wagons, to eat what is left when the plates are cleared. From its humble beginnings, that tolerance is a calculated kindness. Over time, she is pulled closer, her sharp tongue and hard-earned resilience fitting into the camp's rhythm, until her bond with John Marston turns a transaction into a story of reluctant belonging. John, as another stray Dutch, has already folded into his philosophy, a former street thief turned surrogate son. When Abigail becomes pregnant, the dynamic changes again. A woman who once survived by drifting between camps now becomes central through the child that ties her to one man and by extension to Dutch's entire vision. Around the fire, Dutch praises family in the truest sense, yet the irony is clear. This family began with a woman no one wanted to claim, now held up as proof that the gang offers more than the cold cruelty of civilization. Others join under different stars. Javier Escuella comes with a guitar, a revolutionary past, and the sting of betrayal from failed uprisings in Mexico. Dutch sells him not just outlaw work, but justice, promising that robbing the powerful in this dying frontier is simply a continuation of his old war. Bill Williamson arrives broken in another way, a discharged soldier with a drinking problem and a history of failure, mocked by the very army that once owned him. To Bill, Dutch offers not speeches about progress, but a place to stand where no one laughs, where loyalty is valued more than rank. This is Dutch's genius and his danger. He tailors his pitch with surgical precision. To Javier, a story of revolution. To Bill, a story of respect. To Arthur and John, a story of fathers and sons. To some he sells justice, to others adventure, to others simply a warm plate and a name to belong to. In every version, he is the living embodiment of the plan, the indispensable center of their new identity. So the camp becomes a tapestry of trauma and hope, a fragile world held together by songs, stew, and shared enemies. Men who fled betrayal, women who fled hunger, children who never knew another life, all laughing under Dutch's watchful eye, convinced they have escaped the corruption outside their circle. But what is the pattern beneath this apparent refuge? Dutch does not merely recruit talent, he recruits wounds. Wounded people cling hardest to the hand that pulls them from the dark, even when that hand is steering them toward a cliff. As the fire burns low, the promises grow brighter, and the old ways were dying just beyond the tree line. The next chapter of this family story will show what happens when those promises meet a world that refuses to bend. As the promises glow against the dying fire, the gang's creed does not stay in the circle. It rides out with them. The next morning, that philosophy is strapped to saddles and hidden in saddlebags, turned into dynamite, masks, and steel. A story of loyalty and betrayal becomes, in the truest sense, a traveling ritual. A typical job begins in whispers around that fire. Dutch stands, back to the flames, painting a picture. A train fat with government bonds, a bank swollen with mining money, a vault owned by men who never held a shovel. He paces, gestures, names the enemy. The railroads are instruments of oppression. The banks are thieves in suits. The rich are parasites feeding on honest folk. In his telling, this is not a robbery. It is a sermon with guns. From its humble beginnings as a small outlaw family robbing stagecoaches, the pattern hardens. Masks are pulled down, horses surge through the dark, and the world shrinks to hooves, breath, and the distant wail of a train whistle. On the cars, lantern light flickers over terrified passengers while Dutch's voice cuts through the chaos, promising no one will be hurt if they cooperate, insisting this is justice, not greed. The dynamite goes off, the safe door screams open, and for a heartbeat the gang stands in the glow of flying banknotes, convinced that Dutch's philosophy has weight in this world. Arthur moves through these scenes as the living embodiment of Dutch's ideals. He takes point, kicks in doors, hauls bags, keeps order with a hard stare and a steady gun. He feels pride in the precision, in the way the gang moves as one. To him, for a long time, each successful heist proves that their dreams of freedom and family are not delusions. John, by contrast, hesitates. He does the work, but his questions linger under the bravado. Why is every last job followed by another? Why do the rich always seem richer, even after the gang bleeds for Dutch's plan? When a job hits big, a bank in Valentine, a train for Cornwall, Dutch treats the payout as prophecy fulfilled. The camp feasts, the fire roars higher, and every full plate becomes evidence that the world can still be bent to his will through courage and faith. Failures are never his fault. They are betrayals, accidents, temporary setbacks. Success is destiny. Failure is treachery. Yet beyond the tree line, civilization is tightening its grip. Telegraph wires hum with news of each robbery, rail networks move Pinkertons faster than any horse, and the same rituals that once made the gang legends begin to look like suicide missions performed in slow motion. How long can a man preach freedom from the barrel of a gun when the world was changing faster than he can reload? The next heist will force that question into the open. That next heist does not arrive in a vacuum. It arrives in a world racing ahead, a world where the gang's rituals of campfires and horseback councils are being swallowed by steel, smoke, and wire. The story of the Vanderlinda gang is not just a tale of outlaws and lawmen. It is a story of a civilization speeding up until men like Dutch can no longer see themselves in its reflection. Across America, railroads stitch distant territories into a single economic body. Iron tracks carve through mountains and prairies, turning week-long rides into overnight journeys, turning hidden valleys into brief scenic interruptions from a carriage window. Telegraph lines hum overhead, the living embodiment of a new age where information moves faster than any horse, where a robbery in Lemoyne becomes headline gossip in Blackwater before the gang has even split the take. Cities swell with industry and capital. St. Denis chokes on its own progress, factories belching smoke, streetcars clattering over cobblestones, bankers and brokers moving money that never touches their hands. The Dutch. This is the enemy in the truest sense. An invisible empire of ledgers and contracts replacing the tangible dangers of guns and badges. The world was changing, and in that change the old ways were dying. Law enforcement changes with it. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency, once a private hammer for railroads and tycoons, becomes a professional manhunting machine. Files replace rumors. Budgets replace bounties. Men like Milton and Ross are not local sheriffs guessing at trails. They are managers of a nationwide operation, feeding reports through telegraph offices, using rail timetables and informants to close the net. Outlaw hunting becomes less a chase and more an audit. Inside the gang, the tension is palpable. Hosea, ever the pragmatist, reads newspapers, watches train schedules, studies bank security that now includes safes designed for dynamite and guards drilled in modern tactics. Arthur feels it on his skin. More patrols on the roads, more wanted posters, more civilians willing to talk to the law. They warn Dutch that the frontier he worships is not just shrinking, it is being surveyed, fenced, and insured. Dutch refuses. From its humble beginnings, his philosophy has been simple and intoxicating. Courage, loyalty, and willpower can bend the world. So he clings to horseback raids and frontier romanticism, insisting that a bold plan and brave men can outrun telegraphs, outshoot repeating rifles, outthink a bureaucracy backed by railroads and banks. To admit otherwise would mean admitting that his dream has an expiration date. When Hosea suggests smaller jobs, quieter exits, perhaps even a final retirement that does not involve a pile of corpses and a steamship, Dutch waves him off with familiar promises. One last big score, one last town, one last train. Each failure becomes a temporary setback, each warning recast as doubt or near betrayal. How could the man who has been the gang's guiding star from the very beginning accept that the sky itself is changing? This denial is not just stubbornness, it is survival of the ego. Dutch needs to believe the old rules still apply, that freedom can still be seized at gunpoint from a world that has moved on without him. That need becomes a fuse burning steadily toward Blackwater, where the dream of one last big score will collide head-on with modern America's cold, efficient reality. But before Blackwater, before that collision with civilization's steel and steam, the cracks in Dutch's philosophy were already showing. The dream was still alive. The speeches were still beautiful. Yet the choices beneath them were growing uglier, riskier, harder to defend. From its humble beginnings, the gang's robbery targets had been framed as necessary evils in a corrupt world. Banks that funded railroads, stagecoaches carrying company payrolls, rich men who treated the frontier as their private chessboard. Now, Dutch's eye began to wander toward jobs that proved a point rather than simply filled the camp's stew pot. A quiet mail coach with easy money would be passed over in favor of a heavily guarded train, not because it was smarter, but because it was grand, because it made a statement. In the truest sense, the gang became the stage on which Dutch performed his own legend. When a risky score went sideways and bullets started flying, Dutch would stand in the smoke and insist it had all been necessary. A man shot through the lung? A camp forced to move in the dead of night? These were sacrifices for freedom, the cost of doing what other men are too cowardly to do. The danger was real, but the language wrapped it in glory. Hosea noticed. Hosea always noticed. Away from the fire, where the younger outlaws could not hear, the two old partners argued in low, tense voices. Hosea pressed for smaller jobs, for safe hits that would keep the children fed and the Pinkertons guessing. Dutch brushed him off with a smile that did not reach his eyes, promising that one big score would solve everything. How many times had that promise been made? How many times had it slipped through their fingers like river water? This was a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, but the betrayal here was subtle. Dutch was not selling the gang out to the law, he was selling them out to his own ego. He began to choose jobs that made him feel like the living embodiment of resistance, even when Hosea's careful plan suggested easier paths. When things went wrong, as they increasingly did, Dutch's mind recoiled from the simplest explanation, that his judgment was failing. Instead, there was always a scapegoat. a snitch in town, a rival gang lurking in the shadows, the cruelty of a world that refused to let a man live free. Cognitive dissonance became his constant companion. The more reality contradicted his self-image as a brilliant, selfless leader, the more elaborate his justifications became. Could Dutch be wrong? No. The world was wrong. The old ways were dying, and in his mind that meant the world itself had betrayed him. By this point, his need to see himself as heroic began to outweigh his duty to protect the family that trusted him with their lives. Each new scheme carried a little more danger, a little less caution, a little more theater. The gang still believed they were following a leader with a plan. In truth, they were following a man who had started believing his own legend. Even as the legend dragged them closer to the edge, Dutch's legend was built on speeches about freedom and family, but his closest relationships revealed something more fragile beneath the performance. Nowhere is that clearer than in the way he loved, and in the way he needed to be loved in return. The story of Dutch and the women around him is a story of affection and control, of tenderness wrapped around a quiet fear of being abandoned. From the very beginning, Annabelle was different. She was not just another camp follower. She was Dutch's partner in the truest sense, a woman who believed in his philosophy and shared the early hunger of the gang's rise. Their bond, from its humble beginnings, seemed almost domestic by outlaw standards. Shared fires, private jokes, plans for a future beyond the endless road. When Colm O'Driscoll's men killed her, it did more than break Dutch's heart. It turned his grief into theater. Vengeance became a stage on which he could prove his love, over and over, to a woman who was no longer there to answer. In Annabelle's absence, Dutch's need for devotion did not fade. It shifted. Years later, Molly O'Shea stepped into that empty space, not as an equal partner, but as an audience. Dutch paraded her through camp, kissed her in front of the others, draped her in the trappings of romance. Yet when she asked for something simple and human, a future, a promise, a straight answer, his charm curdled into impatience. Was this really love, or was it a man rehearsing the role of the grieving, passionate outlaw he believed himself to be? Dutch also cast himself as the protector of the camp's women, a role that was both noble and intoxicating. Abigail, the girls in the tent, even Mary Beth and Tilly were folded into his rhetoric about family. He would stand in the middle of camp, voice raised, swearing that no man, no law, no civilization would ever harm them while he still breathed. It sounded heroic, yet there was a quiet irony beneath it. The more danger his plans invited, the more they needed his protection, and the more central he became to their survival. That protector mask slipped whenever his authority was threatened. When Molly drank and lashed out, accusing Dutch of neglect and betrayal, his response was not empathy but cold distance, letting Susan Grimshaw enforce order while he watched. When Abigail challenged him over John, or when Sadie Adler demanded to fight rather than hide, the flash of jealousy was unmistakable. Not romantic jealousy, but possessive outrage that his family might choose another path, another leader, another definition of freedom. Sadie, in particular, became the living embodiment of a challenge Dutch could not easily control. Once a grieving widow hidden in a shack, she grew into a relentless gunfighter who judged men by actions, not ideals. She remembered who actually rode into danger for her, who bled beside her, who treated her as a partner rather than a symbol. As Dutch's speeches grew longer and his plans more desperate, Sadie's loyalty shifted toward those whose courage was quiet instead of theatrical. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch could feel his grip on his people loosening with every failed scheme. Faced with that loss, reflection would have meant admitting fault, admitting that his dreams had become delusions. Dutch was not ready for that. So when love no longer guaranteed obedience, when gratitude no longer ensured control, his answer was simple and terrifying. He would not let go. He would squeeze harder. The question was not whether that pressure would break the gang. The question was who it would crush first. That pressure needed a direction. It needed someone to point it, to justify it, to tell Dutch that squeezing harder was not cruelty, but strength. That someone arrived in the form of Micah Bell. Micah did not drift into the gang from its humble beginnings, earning trust over time. He crashed into it. Brash, vicious, always a little too eager to spill blood, he came to Dutch already rehearsed, already flattering, already performing the role of devoted disciple. From the very beginning, older members felt the wrongness. Arthur saw a bully, Charles saw a vulture. Even Bill, no stranger to violence, sensed that Micah enjoyed it in a way that made him uneasy. Yet to Dutch, Micah looked like proof that his philosophy still inspired loyalty. Here was a man willing to rob, torture, and kill in the truest sense for the cause, without hesitation, without complaint. Where others questioned, Micah obeyed. Where others winced, Micah grinned. Dutch, under siege from doubt and failure, saw not a lost soul, but an answer. A follower who would never ask if the story they were living still matched the words he preached. Micah understood exactly what Dutch needed. He volunteered for the dirtiest work, the raids that crossed lines the older gang members still pretended existed. He would burn a town, execute prisoners, or stir up feuds, then return to camp boasting about Dutch's genius, insisting that only a man of true vision could command such chaos. Was it flattery? Of course. But to a leader whose dreams were curdling into delusions, it sounded like confirmation. This put him in direct contrast with Hosea. Hosea counseled patience, smaller scores, less blood. He spoke of survival, of adapting as the world was changing, of accepting that the old ways were dying. Micah whispered a different gospel: never back down, never forgive, never compromise. Where Hosea urged Dutch to see people, Micah urged him to see enemies. One voice asked what was right, the other asked what was strong. As the failures mounted, it was clear which voice fit Dutch's wounded pride. When plans went wrong, Micah never suggested Dutch rethink his approach. He blamed traitors, weak links, invisible plots. Criticism became betrayal, concern became insubordination. Each setback was twisted into proof that only the ruthless survived in this new, encroaching civilization. Micah did not create Dutch's paranoia. He curated it. He did not invent Dutch's capacity for betrayal. He simply assured him it was necessary. Dutch had always carried darkness within him, a story of freedom and family balanced against control and fear. Micah's presence did not change who Dutch was. It merely gave that darkness a voice, loud and unashamed, and soon that voice would not be content to whisper from the shadows. Micah's voice was the spark, but Blackwater was the explosion. The ferry job was not just another score. It was the moment Dutch's grand philosophy collided head-on with the hard walls of civilization and finally cracked. Blackwater itself was a symbol of the new world that was closing in. A booming port town, rail lines humming, telegraph wires humming louder, Pinkertons and marshals moving through the streets with the quiet confidence of salaried men. The old ways were dying, and Dutch felt it in his bones. So he promised his family one last, perfect robbery, a heavily guarded ferry, government bonds, enough money to disappear beyond the reach of this new America forever. In the truest sense, it was pitched as the end of a story of struggle and the beginning of a life of freedom. From the very beginning, though, the plan carried a shadow. Hosea, ever the strategist, read the town, counted the badges, watched the patrols, and saw not opportunity but a noose. Arthur, hardened by years at Dutch's side, shared those doubts. Why hit a ferry crawling with law when quieter banks, trains, and stagecoaches still existed out in the territories? Why challenge the living embodiment of progress on its own doorstep? Dutch's answer never really changed. The world was changing. The noose was already around their necks, and they had to strike big or die small. He framed it as necessity, as philosophy, as destiny. To turn back would mean admitting that his dreams had been outpaced by railroads and ledgers. So he pushed forward. Hosea protested, then relented. Arthur questioned, then obeyed. This was the pattern that had sustained the gang from its humble beginnings, and it carried them straight onto that doomed ferry. The robbery went wrong almost immediately. The guards were more numerous, better prepared, and faster to respond than Dutch had predicted. Shots rang out in tight corridors, smoke turned the air into a choking fog, and civilians screamed as bullets punched through wood and flesh without discrimination. In the chaos, gang members were separated, some cut down, some forced to flee into the dark water or the alleys of Blackwater. Dutch, trying to force control back onto a situation already lost, fired into the panic and killed an innocent woman. A single pull of the trigger, and his legend was stained in a way he could never undo. For a heartbeat, he was shaken. Then the armor closed. Shock buried itself under bluster. Dutch insisted the law had been tipped off, that there had to be a traitor, that bad luck and betrayal had ruined an otherwise perfect plan. Responsibility shifted away from his own miscalculation and onto invisible enemies. Could his philosophy be wrong, or was the whole world conspiring against him? The gang fled into the mountains, half frozen, half starved, the dream of Blackwater's fortune sinking beneath the waves behind them. Dutch spoke of regrouping, of another plan, of a future still within reach. But the stain on his soul and on his story was already there, even if he refused to see it. And in that blizzard, as the gang huddled in the ruins of Coulter, the question became unavoidable. How many more lives would Dutch spend trying to prove that Blackwater had not been his fault? Out in the mountains, that question was not abstract. It was written in frostbite and empty bellies. The flight from Blackwater did not end when the boat pushed off the shore. It only changed form, becoming a slow, punishing march into the grizzlies, where the wind itself felt like an enemy. The trek to Coulter stripped the gang of its illusions as surely as it stripped them of warmth. Men who had swaggered through towns now hunched over in threadbare coats, leading half-starved horses through waist-deep snow. The confident chatter of earlier camps faded into muttered curses and chattering teeth. This was no longer a story of daring outlaws defying civilization. It was a line of refugees stumbling through a world that no longer had room for them. In the ruins of Coulter, Dutch tried to rebuild more than just a camp. He tried to rebuild the narrative. He walked from room to room in that abandoned mining town, checking on the sick, clapping shoulders, promising food, warmth, a plan. His speeches still flowed, full of talk about freedom, family, and the unfairness of the modern world. But there was a brittle edge now, a tightness around the eyes, a strain in the voice. For the first time, it sounded as though Dutch was arguing with himself as much as with the cold. Arthur felt that tension long before he could name it. From its humble beginnings, his loyalty to Dutch had been instinctive, almost reflexive, born from rescue and raised on gratitude. Yet in Coulter, every time Dutch spoke of destiny and justice, Arthur saw other images: bodies on the ferry, blood in the water, the look on Hosea's face when the plan went wrong. The old rhetoric did not vanish overnight, but it began to ring hollow, echoing against the bare wooden walls rather than settling in his bones. To hold the gang together, Dutch reframed Blackwater as a noble stand against a corrupt world. They had not botched a robbery. They had struck at the heart of a rotten civilization and paid the price that true revolutionaries always pay. The dead became martyrs, the failure became proof that the system was rigged, and Dutch, in the truest sense, cast himself as the living embodiment of resistance. It was comforting, it was inspiring, it was also a shield against guilt. Here, the pattern truly began. Catastrophe, followed by a self-exonerating story. Pain, followed by a philosophy that made the pain meaningful. How many times could that cycle repeat before those who remembered the details, the hesitation, the bad calls, the needless risks, started to see the cracks? Arthur's doubts in the snow were the very beginning of that erosion. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch refused to admit that his own choices had hastened the end. In Coulter, that refusal kept the gang moving. In time, it would drive them toward far warmer places and far colder betrayals. From the frozen white of Coulter, the gang rode down into color. The snow gave way to green fields, soft dirt roads, and the rolling hills around Horseshoe Overlook, just outside the rough cattle town of Valentine. After Blackwater, after the dead and the failure no one wanted to name, the sight of open pasture and blue sky felt like a reprieve, almost a blessing. Almost, Horseshoe Overlook was, in the truest sense, Dutch's attempt to rewind the story. Tents went up in familiar patterns, the wagon circle forming that makeshift village that had always been the living embodiment of his philosophy, outlaws as a chosen family, surviving on their own terms, just beyond the reach of civilization. Chores were assigned, the stew pot simmered, and the sounds of laughter, arguments, and guitar strings floated over the ledge as if the mountains had been a bad dream that could now be forgotten. Dutch worked hard to make it feel that way. He sent small parties into Valentine for modest jobs, debt collections, stagecoach scouting, the occasional robbery that could be passed off as necessity rather than ambition. He presided over poker games, leaning back with a cigar, telling stories from its humble beginnings of the gang's early days, when every robbery felt righteous and every escape felt fated. Around the fire, He painted distant shores in vivid detail, Tahiti with its mangoes and sugar plantations, Australia with its untamed interior, places where a man could still breathe free. Those speeches mattered. They were a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, compressed into a single promise: endure this hardship now, and paradise waits over the horizon. Who in that camp did not need to believe that, at least for a while? Arthur listened, as he always had, but the cadence felt different now. The more Dutch talked about mangoes, the more it sounded as though he was trying to convince himself. Because beneath the green fields, the ground was already shaking. The Pinkertons had not forgotten Blackwater. Milton and Ross were tightening the net, watching Valentine, listening for rumors of a charismatic outlaw with a silver tongue and a price on his head. Money remained short, the Blackwater haul untouchable, and every little job carried the risk of exposure. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch's margin for error was shrinking by the day. Arthur began to notice the gap between Dutch's plans and Dutch's reality. A simple wagon robbery turned messy. A debt collection escalated into cruelty that Hosea quietly disapproved of. Each time something went wrong, Dutch reframed it as a temporary setback, a minor inconvenience on the road to that one last big score. Was it strategy, or was it denial? The answer sat in how hard he leaned on that fantasy. As pressure grew, Dutch's talk of Tahiti stopped being a distant dream and became a tool. He dangled escape in front of frightened people, promising freedom if they just held on a little longer, trusted him a little more, followed him a little further into danger. Loyalty became less about shared belief and more about unquestioning faith. Horseshoe Overlook, for all its warmth and routine, was a rehearsal for something darker. The move to Rhodes, the entanglement with the Braithwaites and the Greys, would show how far Dutch was willing to gamble with other people's lives to keep that dream alive, and how quickly a green valley could turn into a graveyard. Rhodes was the dream dressed up as respectability. A sleepy, sun-bleached town where the magnolias drooped, the paint peeled, and old money clung to its pride the way a drowning man clings to driftwood. It was the living embodiment of a South that refused to admit the world was changing, a place where the plantations still ruled, even as the soil beneath them turned to dust. From its humble beginnings, the Vanderlinda gang had robbed banks and trains. In Rhodes, Dutch set his sights on something older and far more rotten. The Braithwaites and the Greys, two decaying dynasties locked in a generations-long feud, offered him a new kind of score, not just cash, but the satisfaction of humiliating the very civilization he claimed to despise. Dutch strolled into their parlors in a borrowed suit, quoting poetry, tipping his hat, playing the gentleman outlaw in the truest sense. To Catherine Braithwaite, he was a charming rogue. To Leigh Gray, he was a useful ally. To himself, he was the spider in the middle of a very old web. He promised each family what they wanted most. To the Greys, he offered muscle and cunning against their rivals. To the Braithwaites, he offered disruption and a chance to bleed their enemies. Secretly, he planned to bleed them both, convinced that centuries of hatred were just another game of cards, and that he held all the winning hands. Was there arrogance in that belief, or simple delusion? By this point, the line was already blurring. Hosea saw it first. The brittle smiles at the Braithwaite estate, the cruelty behind the gray politeness, the way the town's respectable men talked about human beings as property and collateral. To Hosea, this was not a story of noble rebels striking at tyrants. It was a decaying world devouring itself. Arthur felt it too. Every trip into Rhodes, every errand for the sheriffs or the plantation matriarchs, made him uneasy. They were inserting their makeshift family into a feud that had nothing to do with freedom, philosophy, or any idealistic dream. They voiced their misgivings. Hosea urged caution, smaller jobs, a quiet exit before the powder keg blew. Arthur warned that these people were different, powerful, vindictive, and steeped in a kind of hatred that could not be managed with charm. Dutch listened, nodded, and then brushed it aside. He told them this was the plan that would set them up for good, that exploiting the Braithwaites and Greys was justice for every poor soul crushed under old money boots. In truth, the game itself had become the reward. Dutch was no longer just fighting the system, he was savoring the chance to outwit it, to dance with the very devils he condemned. Playing both sides, flattering their egos, sending his own people into their mansions and fields, he treated each move as proof of his genius. The stakes for his family climbed higher with every lie, every delivery, every meeting under those dripping trees. and in the middle of that crumbling southern theater, one question hung over the campfires at Clemens Point. When the Braithwaites and the Greys finally realized they were being played, who would they really come for first? The answer came at night. First, the Braithwaites struck where Dutch was weakest, not on the battlefield, but in the place he claimed to protect most fiercely, the camp. The children, the idea of family as sanctuary. Jack Marston, small and curious and already half in awe of the outlaw world around him, vanished from the shore at Clemens Point while the adults argued about money and plans. One moment he was playing with Tilly and Abigail's patience. The next, only his abandoned book remained. The shock that followed was not theatrical. Abigail's screams tore through the trees, raw and animal. A mother who had already lost too much staring at an empty space where her son should have been. John, who had spent years running from responsibility, suddenly crashed into it headfirst. Frantic, guilty, furious with himself and with everyone else. For all their talk of freedom and loyalty, the gang stood there in the truest sense as a story of failure, armed, dangerous, and utterly powerless to protect a child. Dutch's response came fast. It was not introspection. It was rage. He promised fire and blood for the Braithwaites, swore that no one stole from his family, no one took a Vanderlinda child. Yet beneath the vows, there was something colder, almost clinical. He did not question the wisdom of tying his people to a decaying feud between plantation dynasties. He did not reconsider the philosophy that had brought them here. Instead, he escalated. If the world was changing, he would answer with more violence, not less. The pattern had already been written in Rhodes. Before Jack was taken, the town's genteel fade had cracked open in a hail of gunfire. Sean Maguire, loud, reckless, and beloved, rode into what he thought was a routine meeting with the Greys, laughing and trading jabs, the living embodiment of the gang's youthful bravado. He never made it off the wagon. A single shot to the head dropped him in the street, and then the ambush erupted around Arthur and the others. Sean's death was not a random bullet in a random town. It was the direct price of Dutch's decision to play kingmaker between the Greys and Braithwaites, to use his family as pieces in someone else's crumbling game of civilization and decay. In that moment, the old ways were dying in the dust of Rhodes, and Dutch was still pretending he could ride the corpse to freedom. Arthur felt it. Grief for the kid who had turned every campfire into a performance. Shame that the promise of a better life kept ending in shallow graves. And under it all, a quiet, growing realization, Dutch's plans were costing lives, but not closing the distance between their current misery and the dreams he kept painting in the sky. How many more would it take? How many more lost soul offerings before the plan started working? Jack's kidnapping and Sean's murder did not stand alone. They were early entries in a ledger Dutch refused to read, proof that his pride demanded blood payment from everyone around him while he stayed at the center, untouched, insisting that salvation waited just one more job away. The tragedy was simple and devastating. The more the gang bled, the less Dutch was willing to admit he had led them into the slaughter. And Rhodes was only the rehearsal. The next stage of his grand design would demand even greater sacrifices, in a city where the gang's illusions of control would finally collide with a modern world that did not care about their codes, their speeches, or their dreams. Rhodes was rehearsal. Shady Belle was opening night. When Jack disappears, Dutch dresses the response in the language of family and justice. A child stolen, a debt of blood, a house that has to fall. But when the gang rides through the Braithwaite gates at night, torches flaring against the darkness, the scene is no longer a feud between southern dynasties. It is a story of an outlaw prophet proving to himself that his word can still remake the world. The charge on Braithwaite Manor is chaos and choreography in equal measure. Horses thunder up the drive, men shout over the crack of rifles, glass shatters as lantern light collides with moonlight. Dutch is at the front, coat flaring, pistol raised, calling orders that sound less like tactics and more like sermons. The old ways were dying, and he intends to write their obituary in gunpowder and fire. Inside, the fighting is brutal and close. Braithwaite men fall on staircases and in parlors, their grand portraits watching silently as the house turns into a killing ground. Arthur pushes forward with the others, room by room, searching for Jack, the promise of rescue steadying his hand even as the scale of the slaughter grows harder to ignore. This is not a clean extraction. This is an execution. Dutch, though, is almost radiant. not merely determined, but energized, as if every collapsing banister and every screaming air confirms his philosophy in the truest sense. When torches hit the drapes and the manor begins to burn, he does not flinch, he lingers. He watches the flames crawl up the bones of a dynasty, and there is a flicker of triumph in his eyes. What is this, if not proof that civilization is fragile and he is the living embodiment of its reckoning? On the surface, the raid is about Jack. Dutch says it, the gang believes it, and the ride-in feels righteous. Yet beneath that, something more personal is at work. The Braithwaites humiliated the gang, toyed with their trust, treated them as pawns. Now Dutch is erasing them. From its humble beginnings, his crusade against power was aimed upward at rail barons and government agents. Here, he discovers how intoxicating it is to annihilate an entire house simply because it dared cross him. Arthur gets the outcome he wants. Jack is found, terrified but alive, and carried out past burning doors into the night air. There is real relief, real gratitude, real loyalty in that moment. But as the gang rides away, the inferno behind them lighting the swamp, Arthur's satisfaction is threaded with unease. Was all this fire necessary? Or was Dutch starting to crave the spectacle more than the strategy? Because once a leader learns he can burn a mansion to the ground, slaughter a family, and still be cheered for it, what does he tell himself the next time? That fate demanded it, that betrayal forced his hand, that the dream required one more sacrifice? The world was changing, his plans were failing, and Shady Belle marked the night Dutch realized that if reality would not bend to his dreams, he could always try to burn reality instead. And in the glow of that burning house, the path to Saint Denis begins to take shape. Saint Denis is the opposite of that burning house. The gang rides out of smoke and cinders into a city of electric light, iron, and noise, and for Dutch Vanderlinde it feels less like refuge and more like an invasion from the future. The world was changing, and for the first time in years, Dutch is not the one directing the change. Saint Denis hits the gang as sensory overload. Streetcars clatter past gas lamps and glowing bulbs, factory whistles scream over the harbor, and crowds press in from every side. A living river of workers, bankers, immigrants, and beggars. This is not the open country where a few rifles and a fast horse can solve a problem. This is civilization in the truest sense, layered, anonymous, and indifferent. The old ways were dying here, drowned out by machinery and money, and Dutch can feel it in his bones. On the surface, he adapts. He puts on fine clothes, smooths his hair, and walks the boulevards as if he belongs among the gentlemen and theater-goers. Dutch has always been the living embodiment of performance, an outlaw who survives by turning philosophy into theater. In Saint Denis, he leans into that role, speaking of revolution and corruption with the same grand cadence, as if rhetoric alone can bend this new world. Yet beneath the polished veneer, the city exposes the limit of his methods. Who does one rob when everyone is hiding behind corporations, banks, and faceless institutions? That question leads him straight to Angelo Bronte. Bronte is a mirror held up to Dutch's future, a powerful man operating outside the law while entirely embedded within the new order. He lives in a mansion, controls politicians, and treats crime as business rather than crusade. Their first meetings are almost darkly ironic. Two men who once would have tried to rob each other now trading favors over wine and opera. Dutch sees in Bronte a story of what an outlaw can become when he stops pretending he is fighting for freedom and admits he is fighting for control. But the city also sharpens Dutch's paranoia. There are more lawmen, more informants, more eyes in every window. Every alley could hide a Pinkerton, every bar could hold a snitch. For a man already inclined to blame betrayal rather than his own mistakes, Saint Denis is poison. Each close call, each whispered rumor, reinforces the belief that only he can see the full board, that only his mind is quick enough to navigate this maze of cobblestones and corruption. From its humble beginnings in snowy Coulter to these crowded docks. The gang's journey has been a story of shrinking horizons, of dreams chasing a vanishing frontier. In Saint Denis, Dutch refuses to admit that horizon is gone. He will try to bend this new world to his will, to prove that his philosophy still has teeth in an age of telegraphs and stock exchanges. And the way he chooses to prove it, the plan he builds in this city of lights, will be nothing short of catastrophic, so Dutch reaches for the grand gesture. If Saint Denis is the living embodiment of the new America, then he will rob its heart. The bank job is framed as more than a score, it is a final argument with history. A story of one outlaw demanding that civilization acknowledge his freedom in hard cash and gold. From its humble beginnings, the gang had chased a horizon of safety and escape, but this is the moment Dutch insists that horizon is finally within reach. He tells Arthur, Hosea, and the others that this will replace Blackwater, wipe away that stain, and buy passage overseas to some distant shore where the world was changing more slowly. Guarma is mentioned, Tahiti is dangled, a mango farm becomes the new fantasy. After months of poverty and humiliation, the promise is intoxicating. Who would not want to believe that one last job could redeem every failure? The plan itself is meticulous on paper, disguises, timed entries, roles assigned with military precision. Dutch walks into the St. Denis Bank in a fine suit, calm and theatrical, turning a simple robbery into a performance of control. The doors are locked, the customers cowed, the manager bullied into opening the way to the vault. For a brief, breathless stretch, it works. The drills bite into steel, the gang hauls out bundles of bonds and glittering stacks of money, and Dutch can almost taste vindication. Then the old ways we're dying becomes more than a phrase. It becomes gunfire. The law does not trickle in, it crashes down. Pinkertons and police surround the building with rifles, shotguns, and a confidence born from telegraphs, coordination, and a city's worth of reinforcements. The bank, meant to be a gateway to freedom, turns into a cage. The pattern interrupt comes on the street outside. Hosea, unarmed and posing as a harmless decoy, is seized in the crowd. Milton does not bargain, he does not speechify, he simply executes Hosea in front of Dutch's eyes. In one brutal instant, Dutch's oldest friend, his partner from the very beginning, the man who questioned his excesses and softened his philosophy, is gone. A moment later, during the chaotic escape across the rooftops, Lenny is cut down by rifle fire, his body tumbling into the dark. Two pillars of the gang vanish in the space of minutes. Dutch's reaction is a study in psychological whiplash. Shock freezes him, then rage ignites, then something colder settles in. Admitting that his own ambition led them here would shatter the story he tells about himself. So he reaches for betrayal instead. They were set up. Someone talked. The answer, he insists, is not to retreat but to push harder, to double down on risk, to prove that Hosea and Lenny did not die for nothing. But without Hosea to argue, to caution, to quietly pull him back from the edge, Dutch's worst traits begin to accelerate unchecked. The paranoia that once flickered now burns. The grandiosity that once inspired now distorts into delusions. Cruel choices, once unthinkable, start to feel necessary. The bank job does not just break the gang's fortunes in St. Denis, it breaks the last restraints on Dutch's mind, setting the stage for even darker decisions to come. Guarma is where the brakes come off. The gang survives the gunfire in St. Denis only to be swallowed by the sea, their plan reduced to splintered wood and desperate hands clinging to wreckage in the dark. When they wash ashore on that alien beach, half drowned and sun-stunned, it is not just America they have left behind. It is the last illusion that Dutch is in control. From its humble beginnings, the Vanderlinda gang has been tied to the American frontier, to snow and mud and the slow march of civilization. Guarma is the opposite in every way. Tropical, feverish, ruled by a sugar baron and haunted by revolutionaries, it feels like a dream that is curdled into a nightmare. The very beginning of this interlude makes that clear. The gang stumbles through jungle and gunfire, caught between Alberto Fusar's brutal regime and a desperate rebellion that is underfed, outgunned, and morally compromised in its own ways. On this island, there are no clear heroes, no simple villains, only competing tyrannies and half-truths. That chaos mirrors Dutch's mind after Hosea's death. His oldest friend, his conscience, his strategist is gone, and the world was changing faster than his philosophy could keep up. Stranded in a foreign war that means nothing to him, Dutch does not retreat into caution or grief. He expands. He inflates. He seizes Guarma as a new stage. He throws himself into the local conflict with theatrical fervor, promising freedom to men whose names he barely remembers. He talks of oppression, of throwing off chains, of standing against corrupt power, and in the truest sense, those words still echo the man he once tried to be. But the timing betrays him. This is not a carefully chosen cause. This is the first available excuse to play revolutionary again, to be the living embodiment of resistance in a world that has already written him off. Arthur watches the pattern repeat, only faster, sharper, crueler. Dutch makes alliances with Hercule and the rebels, then discards their lives in reckless assaults on the fortress and the docks. He bargains with the very tyrants he condemns, then turns on them when it suits his escape. How many Garmin soldiers die in ambushes he orchestrates? How many rebels are thrown into hopeless charges because Dutch assures them he has a plan? And when those men fall, what does he feel? Almost nothing. That is the horror. Loss that once might have shaken him now becomes fuel for more speeches, more grand promises, more blood. Guarma becomes a rehearsal, a compressed story of what Dutch will do back on American soil, attach himself to causes he barely understands, justify any cruelty as necessary, and blame every failure on betrayal rather than his own delusions. The island ends, the ship sails home, but the man who steps off at Van Horn is no longer merely an outlaw with dreams. He is a leader who has learned he can spend lives for his narrative and feel no need to look back. He leaves Guarma as a survivor. He arrives in Van Horn as something colder than that. The man who steps off that boat carries the same philosophy on his tongue, but now it has teeth, and it bites inward as much as outward. The gang that limps back onto American soil is a shadow of the one that rode into Saint Denis. They are thinner, exhausted, and missing pillars who once made Dutch's world make sense. Hosea is gone. Lenny is gone. Men who died believing that Dutch's dreams of freedom were still, in the truest sense, a path toward a better life. The camp that reforms in the woods near Beaver Hollow is not a community rebuilding from its humble beginnings. It is a triage ward for the remnants of a broken army. In this new camp, Dutch still gathers people to speak, but the music of his words has changed. Earlier, his speeches were a story of resistance and family, railing against civilization and promising that, together, they could stay one step ahead of the world that was changing. Now his voice circles betrayal, enemies, and unseen hands. The Pinkertons, the government, the O'Driscolls, the traitors within. Less about where they are going, more about who has wronged them on the way. Each promise of a plan is edged with bitterness, every reassurance laced with suspicion. Arthur and John feel that change before they can fully name it. Around the fire, in tense whispers and narrowed glances, they notice how often Dutch's gaze drifts to Micah. Micah flatters him, feeds his narrative, tells him he was right about everything from the very beginning. When Arthur questions the wisdom of another suicidal robbery, Dutch dismisses it as doubt. When John wonders about his family, Dutch hears only disloyalty. Micah, by contrast, offers simple answers and loud support, and Dutch rewards that loyalty with trust that once belonged to men who had earned it over decades. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Dutch's relationship to the gang shifts. Once, he was the living embodiment of the idea that this was a family to be protected, that every member mattered. Now, he begins to speak of positions, of leverage, of who can be used where. A dead scout becomes a necessary sacrifice. A wounded gun becomes the cost of doing business. Losses that would have shaken him in earlier years are folded neatly into a story about destiny and persecution, proof that they must be on the right path because the whole world is against them. The old ways were dying, but not only out there in the encroaching towns and railroads. They were dying inside Dutch. The idealistic outlaw father who once shielded strays and lost soul drifters is giving way to a commander who spends lives to protect his ego. How long before his plans do not merely risk his people, but abandon them outright? That answer is coming, and when it arrives, it will force Arthur, John, and the player's own memory of Dutch to collide in a way that cannot be undone. That answer does not arrive in a gunfight or a grand speech. It arrives in a coughing fit. In a cramped Saint Denis doctor's office, surrounded by the trappings of civilization Dutch claims to despise, Arthur Morgan learns he is not just sick. He is dying. Tuberculosis, incurable, advancing, a death sentence delivered without drama, in a world that barely notices one more outlaw slipping away. The infection itself is almost mundane. A debt collection, a poor farmer named Thomas Downs, a desperate struggle in the mud. Blood on Arthur's face, on his lips, swallowed and forgotten in the rush of the gang's chaos. From its humble beginnings, this is a story of how a single, almost trivial moment becomes the hinge on which an entire philosophy swings. As the coughs worsen and his strength fades, Arthur's sense of time changes. Every job, every promise from Dutch, every empty one more score suddenly carries the weight of finality. Facing death strips away his appetite for comforting lies. The rhetoric that once sounded noble now sounds rehearsed. Dutch's speeches about freedom, about striking back at a corrupt world, begin to echo in Arthur's head as something else. Excuses. Excuses for failure, excuses for betrayal, excuses to keep everyone moving so no one stops to ask the simplest question. A pattern interrupt. What if Dutch has no plan at all? With his body failing, Arthur's memory sharpens. He revisits the early days when Dutch and Hosea felt in the truest sense like the living embodiment of an alternative to the world closing in. Dutch taught him to read and dream, Hosea taught him to doubt and observe. Around the campfire, in those years, the philosophy felt idealistic rather than delusional. A fragile attempt to hold back a civilization that crushed the poor and the unwanted. Now, at Beaver Hollow, those memories clash violently with the present. Dutch torturing an informant, abandoning allies, trusting Micah's poison over Hosea's ghost. The contrast becomes unbearable. Arthur starts saying what he once only thought. He challenges Dutch over the death of Hosea, over the doomed rescue of John, over the decision to leave Arthur in the street in Saint Denis. Each confrontation follows the same binary rhythm. Arthur reaches for honesty, Dutch reaches for control. Anger, deflection, accusations of disloyalty. Dutch calls Arthur lost for questioning him, even as Arthur's clarity grows sharper with every cough. This is where loyalty and betrayal change places. Arthur's refusal to indulge Dutch's delusions is painted as treason, while Dutch's willingness to gamble lives is framed as leadership. Who is truly betraying the family now? The old ways were dying, and Dutch cannot accept it. Arthur can. In that acceptance, a new purpose emerges. If he cannot save himself, perhaps he can still save John, Abigail, the others from going down with Dutch. The believer wakes up, and in doing so, becomes the gang's last desperate conscience. Arthur's awakening creates a new fault line, and it runs straight through John Marston. If Arthur is the gang's last conscience, John is its last real chance at escape. Dutch, of course, will treat both as threats. From its humble beginnings, Dutch's family has been a refuge for runaways and broken men. But by Beaver Hollow, the promise has curdled. John looks around and sees not freedom, but graves. Sean, Hosea, Lenny, Kieran. The roll call of the dead grows longer with every plan. Abigail is tired, Jack is frightened, and the world was changing faster than any outlaw philosophy can keep up. John's old dream of being Dutch's heir is gone, a quieter dream takes its place. A ranch, honest work, a life where his son does not sleep beside a rifle. This desire to leave is, in the truest sense, a rational response to disaster, yet Dutch reads it as betrayal. When John goes missing after Guarma, and later when he speaks openly of leaving, Dutch does not hear fear or exhaustion, he hears defiance. The man who once bragged about raising John from a boy now spits words like coward and ungrateful. How convenient is it that every challenge to his leadership becomes a moral failure in someone else? In Dutch's mind, the gang is not trapped in his delusions, the gang is abandoning his sacred cause. Arthur stands in the middle of this widening gulf. From the very beginning, he was the one Dutch sent to drag John back when he disappeared for a year. The enforcer who mocked John's irresponsibility and questioned his loyalty. Now those old taunts echo differently. After witnessing Dutch leave John to die on the rooftops of Saint Denis, Arthur can no longer pretend that the problem is John's commitment. The problem is Dutch's. When John talks about Abigail and Jack, about getting out before the Pinkertons close in, Arthur does something unthinkable for his former self. He agrees. Dutch senses this shift and doubles down on emotional manipulation. He reminds John again and again that he saved him, that without the gang, John would be rotting in some prison or shallow grave. He frames every kindness as a debt, every shared memory as a chain. Is this loyalty, or is it ownership? Dutch's speeches about family become less about shared dreams and more about what is owed to him personally, the living embodiment of the gang's past glory, demanding tribute from those who want a future. Underneath it all lies a terrible, simple question waiting to be answered. When push comes to shove, will Dutch protect John's family, or his own ego. The old ways were dying, and there was no room for both. The tragedy is that, by this point in the story, everyone already knows which one he will choose. Everyone except the man still insisting he has a plan. Dutch answers that question on a bridge and on a train, long before the final shots are fired. The answers do not come in speeches. They come in the silence of hoofbeats riding away. From its humble beginnings, the Vanderlinda gang had been sold as a family in the truest sense. Dutch would tell the story of those early days when he and Hosea dragged people out of nooses, out of jail cells, out of frozen ditches. He had waded into gunfire to pull Arthur out. He had risked everything to retrieve John when he went missing on a job. Once, the leader had been the living embodiment of loyalty under fire. By the time the gang reaches the collapsing trestle bridge and the armored train jobs, that philosophy is gone. On the train near Annisburg, Dutch sends Arthur and John forward into a metal coffin of bullets while he hangs back with Micah, watching the chaos through smoke and distance. When the Pinkertons swarm and John is shot, Dutch does not charge in. He looks, he hesitates, and then he turns away, muttering that John is dead and the gang must be saved. This is not the man from the very beginning, diving into a burning barn for his own. It is a commander performing cold arithmetic. One son down, a dozen people left to manage, and a dream of freedom still to be defended. At least, that is the story he tells himself. The bridge above the ravine makes it worse. Trying to blow the tracks, Dutch again pushes Arthur into the most exposed work while he and Micah keep their distance. When the dynamite fails and the law descends, the retreat is not a coordinated rescue. It is a stampede. Dutch rides hard, abandons Arthur in the dust, and later speaks of hard choices and necessary sacrifices, as if the ambush had been an act of nature rather than the fruit of his own ego. For Arthur, these moments land like bullets that do not heal. The man who once dragged him out of a snowstorm now leaves him bleeding in a railcar. The father who used to say that every member of the gang mattered now treats individuals as expendable parts, useful only so long as the myth of the gang survives. The betrayal is not just physical, it is philosophical. Inside Dutch's mind, the rationalization is relentless. Leaders must be strong. Leaders must not flinch. Leaders must think of the many, not the few. That the many exist mainly to prop up his image, that these crises keep erupting from his own arrogance, is never admitted. Civilization is closing in, the world was changing, and he convinces himself that only ruthlessness can keep the dream alive. So the man who built a family out of every lost soul he could find now uses that family as a shield for his pride. The old ways were dying, but something much darker was being born in their place. The next time Dutch rides away, the cost will not just be measured in blood. It will be measured in who finally turns against him. And when the cost comes due, it does not come from rival outlaws or feuding families. It comes from civilization wearing a badge and a bowler hat. The Pinkertons do not just chase the Vanderlinda gang, they haunt it, turning the dream of freedom into a story of surveillance, pressure, and slow psychological strangulation. From the very beginning of that final year, their presence grows. Agent Milton and his men appear with unnerving precision. On the snowy slopes above Coulter, at Horseshoe Overlook, in Rhodes in St. Denis. Camps the gang believes are hidden in the trees or buried in the swamps are somehow found, surrounded, studied. Each raid feels less random and more surgical, as if the gang's movements are being read off a ledger. The world was changing, and Dutch's enemies were no longer drunken sheriffs. They were professionals who treated him as a problem to be solved. Every close call cuts deeper than bullets. When the Pinkertons close in on Clemens Point, when they flood the streets after the St. Denis Bank, when they ride into Shady Bell under the cover of night, Dutch does not see tactical failure. He sees betrayal. Someone must have talked. Someone must have lost faith. His philosophy cannot be wrong, so the people around him must be. That is the logic that takes hold. Under this logic, suspicion becomes policy. Dutch's eyes linger too long on John when he disappears after Abigail's arrest. He studies Arthur's face when Arthur questions the wisdom of yet another grand plan. He lets Micah whisper in his ear about weak links, doubters, traitors. Each time the Pinkertons appear, Dutch's circle of trust shrinks, and his willingness to punish his own grows. The man who once preached loyalty as salvation now treats loyalty as something proven only by suffering. The camp feels it. Nights grow longer, quieter, more fractured. Men who once sang around the fire now keep their rifles close and their thoughts closer. Women who once laughed in the background now trade worried glances when Dutch starts talking about destiny instead of details. How many more moves can this family survive? How many more times can an ambush be escaped by inches before the question becomes not whether Dutch has a plan, but whether there ever was one in the truest sense? Dutch's response is not to scale back, but to scale up his rhetoric. As money runs dry and safe havens vanish, his speeches grow more grandiose. He talks about the government as a monster, about the gang as the living embodiment of resistance, about a final ride that will buy their freedom forever. Each new failure is reframed as proof that the world is corrupt, that the old ways were dying, that only he sees the path forward. The louder reality screams, the louder Dutch talks over it. Then comes the quiet realization, first in Arthur, then in others. Under this pressure, Dutch is not simply making mistakes, he is changing. The choices he begins to contemplate at Beaver Hollow, the lives he is willing to trade, will cross lines that even his most loyal followers cannot explain away. The pressure cooker is not just closing in around the gang. It is sealing Dutch inside his own delusions, preparing him for the unforgivable decisions that will finally shatter his family. The pressure at Beaver Hollow does not begin in that swamp. It has been building for years, carried on the echo of one name, Colm O'Driscoll. To understand how Dutch ends up trapped inside his own delusions, it is necessary to return to the very beginning of his darkest obsession, to a feud that turns philosophy into a blood sport. Dutch and Colm start as mirrors facing one another across the same dying frontier. Both are charismatic outlaws. Both gather broken men into gangs. Both claim to offer freedom from a corrupt civilization. But where Dutch dresses his crimes in speeches, Colm never pretends. The story of their feud is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family turned into ammunition. When Colm's men kill Annabelle, Dutch's lover, the rivalry stops being professional and becomes personal in the truest sense. From that moment, every O'Driscoll sighting is not just a threat, it is a summons. Dutch hunts them across the years, through ambushes, raids, and failed truces, each encounter escalating the violence. The gang robs trains and banks, but the plans Dutch remembers most vividly are the ones that spill O'Driscoll blood. Even when safer, cleaner scores are on the table, he will divert men, time, and resources to chasing rumors of Colm's whereabouts. How many opportunities die on the vine because Dutch would rather settle an old score than secure his family's future? Strawberry becomes the clearest stage for this obsession. Dutch allows himself to be lured into Colm's trap, walking into town for a supposed parley that any calmer mind would have refused. He is captured, beaten, strung up in the woods as bait for the Pinkertons. The entire gang is endangered, so Dutch can indulge the fantasy that he can outtalk, outthink, or simply outlast his oldest enemy. Even then, when Arthur rescues him, Dutch frames the whole disaster as proof that Colm is a monster and that their war is righteous. Yet Colm is more than a villain in this world. He is the living embodiment of what Dutch could be without the speeches. Cruel, petty, openly self-serving, Colm does not hide behind ideals or pretend his gang is anything but a tool. The old ways were dying, and Colm adapts by embracing pure brutality, while Dutch insists he is still an idealistic rebel. Is there a greater insult to Dutch than seeing his own methods stripped of poetry? So Dutch renames vengeance as justice. Every risky strike against the O'Driscolls becomes a moral crusade, every dead gang member a martyr to the cause. He cannot admit that Colm's existence threatens his self-image, that the hatred burning in his chest is partly hatred of himself. The more he denies that shared nature, the more their paths converge, until the difference between outlaw with a cause and outlaw without one becomes paper-thin. And as that line blurs, another question begins to rise in the camp, quiet at first, then louder. If Dutch and Colm are not so different, what exactly are these men dying for? That question does not stay abstract for long. It takes on a face, a body, a pair of terrified eyes. It becomes Kieran Duffy. Kieran is, in the truest sense, a test of Dutch's philosophy. An ex, O'Driscoll captured in the snow, beaten, mocked, tied to a tree. He is the living embodiment of everything Dutch claims to hate. From the very beginning, his presence in camp asks a simple question. Is this really a family, or just a flag of convenience for an outlaw army? Dutch spares him, talks of giving a man a chance, and folds him into the gang. But mercy without trust is just a slower execution. Kieran rides with them, shovels manure, helps find horses, even risks his life in raids against his former comrades, yet the shadow of calm never leaves him. Bill sneers, Javier doubts. Susan keeps him at the edge of the fire. Dutch calls him boy and O'Driscoll far more often than Kieran. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, but Dutch's need for enemies remains fixed in place. When paranoia peaks at Beaver Hollow, that need demands a sacrifice. Kieran is taken, tortured, and sent back headless on his own horse, his mutilated corpse crashing into camp as a message. Dutch's reaction is chilling. There is no real grief, no rage at the horror inflicted on a young man who tried to belong. Only satisfaction that the threat was real, that his fears were justified. That the gang is surrounded by betrayal. Kieran's story becomes a story of confirmation, not tragedy, in Dutch's mind. Molly O'Shea's fate is even crueler, because she begins not as an enemy, but as a lover. From its humble beginnings, their romance flatters Dutch's self-image, the charming revolutionary and the adoring woman who believes every word. As the dream frays after Blackwater, Dutch drifts away, absorbed in grand plans and Micah's flattery, leaving Molly isolated in a camp where her only power came from his attention. What happens to a person when the sun they orbit stops looking their way? Drunk, furious, desperate to be seen, Molly stumbles into camp and claims she betrayed Dutch to the Pinkertons. It may be true, it may be a lie screamed to wound his pride, but the reaction is instant. Before Dutch even truly questions her, Susan Grimshaw pulls the trigger. Molly dies in the mud, shot down between the man she loved and the woman who once enforced his order. Again, Dutch barely mourns. He lets the death stand. Another neat explanation for failure, another traitor to blame. No reflection on how his neglect, his cold withdrawal, helped drive her to that moment. No admission that his own delusions and arrogance led the Pinkertons to their door long before Molly ever spoke. Arthur, and others, are horrified by how quickly these lives are written off. Kieran, who tried so hard. Molly, who only wanted Dutch to look at her again. If this is how easily the expendable die, what happens when Dutch's fear needs a more important scapegoat? If the lost souls at the edge of the camp are not safe, what chance do his oldest children have when the next plan fails? Question hangs in the air. If Dutch can discard the weak inside his own camp, what happens when an entire people become his next grand gesture? The answer arrives in the form of a proud old chief and his furious son. Standing on the edge of a world that no longer has a place for them, rains fall and eagle flies, lead a native tribe being squeezed between the U.S. Army, government treaties, and the quiet brutality of corporate interests. The world was changing, and the old ways were dying under railroads, oil fields, and paper contracts no one ever intended to honor. In them, there is a story of dignity under siege, of a people pushed off their land in the truest sense, not by bandits, but by civilization dressed in uniforms and suits. From the very beginning, Dutch sees more than their suffering. He sees an opportunity. Here is a cause that mirrors the speeches he has been giving for years, a living embodiment of his philosophy about freedom and oppression. If he can help them strike back, if he can humiliate the government, does that not prove he was right all along? Dutch does not just want to aid a tribe, he wants to cast himself as the revolutionary hero history forgot to write down. Eagle flies, young, impatient, and burning with anger, is easy for him to reach. Dutch feeds that fire. Each raid, each sabotage, each reckless strike against the army is framed as noble resistance, as destiny. When Rains Fall pleads for restraint, for patience, for survival over glory, Dutch nods politely and then whispers something different in the son's ear. The father sees the cost in blood. The outlaw sees a stage, a banner, and a willing martyr. Here the pattern interrupt arrives. For once, Dutch is not the most tragic man in the room. Arthur rides with them, watches the tribe's camps, hears Rains Fall speak of broken promises and poisoned water. He recognizes an idealistic struggle for land, family, and simple freedom, and he also recognizes Dutch's familiar pattern of using broken people as mirrors for his own dreams. Arthur's cough worsens, his doubts deepen, and he understands that this is not from its humble beginnings a rescue, it is another plan. He is torn between loyalty and horror. Helping the tribe feels right, Helping Dutch use them feels like betrayal. Dutch promises that victory will save everyone, that one more strike will finally break their chains. Instead, each victory brings harsher reprisals, more soldiers, more grief. In trying to fight injustice, Dutch amplifies it, leaving eagle flies dead, rains fall in mourning, and the tribe scattered. The supposed freedom fighter has become an accelerant, turning an already cruel fate into a catastrophe carried out in his name. The failure with the Wapiti does not just leave bodies on a battlefield, it leaves the gang spiritually homeless. The dream of being liberators has collapsed, and with it, Dutch's last convincing excuse for the chaos he brings. The next places they live are not just camps on a map, they are the living embodiment of his unraveling mind. Lakay comes first, a rotting shack half sunk in the swamps of Bayou Noir, surrounded by stagnant water, mosquitoes, and mist that never really lifts. From its humble beginnings on open hillsides and riverbanks, the Vanderlinda gang has been pushed into a place where the ground itself feels unsure, where every step sinks. The air is heavy, sound is muffled, and even the sky is mostly hidden by hanging moss. It is a story of freedom turned into confinement, of a family that once basked in sunsets now huddling in shadows. At Lakay, the fear is constant. Pinkertons can emerge from the fog at any moment, and eventually they do, turning the camp into a war zone. Dutch's philosophy, once preached around warm fires with coffee and song, now spills out in hurried whispers and frantic orders. He paces in the cramped rooms, window to window, muttering about betrayal, about spies, about how the world was changing and closing in. The swamp mirrors his paranoia. There are shapes in every tree, threats in every ripple. Who can relax when even the frogs sound like they are warning of an ambush? When Lakay is no longer tenable, the gang does not move toward light. It retreats into darkness. Beaver Hollow is not a camp in the traditional sense. It is a cave in the woods, damp and echoing, carved into the earth like a wound. The entrance is narrow, the interior claustrophobic, lit by weak fires that throw more shadow than warmth. From the very beginning, Dutch had dreamed of open horizons and endless possibility. Now his kingdom is stone walls and a ceiling that presses down. Here, his world shrinks to an echo chamber. Arthur, John, and the old guard are pushed to the margin, while Micah slides closer, feeding Dutch's delusions and resentment. Fewer people gather around the fire. Songs trail off. Conversations die the moment Dutch approaches, replaced by stiff backs and forced smiles. Camp life, once noisy and communal, becomes a series of whispered conferences and sudden arguments, of side glances and unspoken accusations. Loyalty turns brittle, betrayal feels inevitable. The physical journey tells the psychological story. From bright rivers to murky swamps, from open plains to a cave in the woods, the old ways were dying, and Dutch's answer is to burrow inward, deeper into himself, deeper into fantasy. Beaver Hollow will be the final stage, not just for the gang's conflict with law and civilization, but for Dutch's war with his own reflection. Who is he now? Idealistic rebel? Or lost soul who cannot admit the dream is over? At Beaver Hollow, the fantasy finally runs out of road. The cave is dark, airless, claustrophobic, the living embodiment of Dutch's mind closing in on itself. And Arthur Morgan walks through it knowing, in the truest sense, that this is the end of the story the gang has been telling itself since the very beginning. Illness has hollowed him out. The cough, the blood, the weakness in his hands, all of it strips away the old excuses. Dutch's approval no longer matters because time itself has betrayed Arthur, and with that betrayal comes a strange, terrible freedom. If death is certain, then what remains except to decide how to meet it? Freedom for Arthur stops being escape from civilization and becomes something quieter, the freedom to choose what kind of man he dies as. That is why, when the Pinkertons close in and everything shatters, Arthur does not follow Dutch's call to keep running, keep scheming, keep chasing a plan that never truly existed. He turns toward John, the man he once dragged back to camp in chains of loyalty, the man he once beat for abandoning the gang, now becomes the one thing he is determined to save. Arthur chooses to pull John out, to send him toward Abigail and Jack, instead of chasing Dutch's doomed dreams up one more mountain. It is a complete reversal from its humble beginnings, when Dutch's word was law and the gang's survival eclipsed all else. Along the way, Arthur pleads with the others, almost like a prophet who has finally stopped believing in his own religion. With Sadie, he does not promise glory. He talks about getting John's family clear, about ending this. With Charles, he speaks of heading north, of disappearing before the world finishes grinding them down. Over and over, he repeats the same hard truth. The gang is finished. Survival now means letting go, not holding tighter. Even with Dutch himself, Arthur tries one last time. He brings up Micah, the whispers, the betrayals, the way people keep dying while Micah somehow keeps rising in Dutch's esteem. He names the abandoned and the dead, Hosea, Lenny, Miss Grimshaw, and lays them at Dutch's feet as evidence, not of a grand philosophy under siege, but of a man who has lost his way. Dutch once spoke about freedom, about family, about standing against a corrupt world. Now he stands shoulder to shoulder with the snake who sold them all out. The world was changing, and Arthur forces Dutch to see that the old ways were dying not because civilization won, but because Dutch himself could not change. Who is Dutch now? Arthur asks without quite saying the words. Idealistic rebel, or lost soul hiding in a cave? The answer will not come in Beaver Hollow. It will come on a mountain, in the cold, with guns drawn and the last remnants of the gang standing between one man's delusions and another man's final act of mercy. And as Arthur rides toward that ridge, toward his last ride, the question hanging in the air is simple. When Dutch finally looks into that mirror, what or who will he see? The answer comes on the ridge, in the thin air, where the gang's last secret is buried with the last of its illusions. The storm rolls over the mountain, the world closing in, as Arthur drags his dying body toward the satchel that once represented freedom, security, and escape. It is almost funny, in a cruel way. From its humble beginnings, this was a story of high-minded speeches and idealistic robberies, of a family stealing from the rich and corrupt in the name of principle. Now the grand philosophy of Dutch Vanderlinda has been reduced to three men in the mud, clawing toward a bag of cash while the old ways were dying all around them. Arthur reaches the money, Micah reaches Arthur, and then Dutch arrives, the living embodiment of his own contradictions, gun drawn, coat whipping in the wind. The scene fractures into accusations and gunfire. Micah calls Arthur the traitor, the coward, the one who abandoned the gang. Arthur fires back, not with bullets at first, but with truth. He tells Dutch what the player has watched unfold. Micah has been talking to the Pinkertons. Micah has pushed every reckless decision. Micah has been whispering in Dutch's ear while Hosea's voice went silent in the St. Denis smoke. The plans are lies. The dream is dead. This is not a revolution. This is a slow-motion betrayal. Here, the mountain becomes Dutch's mirror. He looks at Arthur, the boy from the very beginning, the man who rode with him through triumph and disaster, who bled for the gang when Dutch still believed his own words. Then he looks at Micah, the sycophant who flatters him, who tells him he is still right, still brilliant, still the visionary standing against civilization. Between them stands the money, a physical reminder of every robbery, every corpse, every compromise he justified as necessary. Dutch hesitates. It is written across his face, the war between loyalty and ego, between the world as it really is and the world as he needs it to be. To believe Arthur means admitting he has been wrong, that his philosophy has curdled into delusions, that he sacrificed Hosea, Lenny, Molly, and the rest for nothing. To believe Micah means clinging to the fantasy that the dream can still be saved if he just pushes harder, runs farther, blames someone else. Then comes the pattern interrupt. Dutch does not shoot Arthur. Dutch does not shoot Micah. He holsters his gun, looks at them both, and walks away. In the truest sense, he abandons judgment itself. He leaves Arthur to die in the sunrise and refuses to name Micah as the rat, choosing a third path that is not courage, not conviction, but escape from his own guilt. That choice, that retreat into ambiguity, is the psychological bridge to the man standing on the cliffs in Blackwater years later. Dutch will keep running, keep planning, keep insisting the world was changing, and he alone understood it, because admitting fault would mean admitting that the great story of Dutch Vanderlinda ended not in martyrdom, but in a single cowardly step backward on a mountain of his own making. After that step back on the mountain, Dutch does not vanish. He recedes. The story simply moves away from him, leaving long, empty years that the games only hint at. But his later behavior makes those missing chapters painfully easy to imagine. From its humble beginnings, his life has been a cycle. Gather the broken, preach a philosophy, chase a dream of freedom, end in blood. There is no reason to believe that pattern stops when Arthur dies and the gang scatters. In the unseen years between Red Dead Redemption 2 and Red Dead Redemption, Dutch almost certainly builds smaller, looser bands around himself, never again a true family, but always an audience. New followers, new speeches, the same old plans. A train here, a government convoy there, each scheme meant to prove that the old ways were dying only because men lacked his courage. Yet beneath that restless motion, guilt sits like a stone. Dutch is too intelligent not to know what happened on that cliff with Arthur, what happened in Saint Denis with Hosea, what happened at every campfire where loyalty was repaid with betrayal. So his mind does what it has always done. It splits. Part of him remembers, part of him refuses. He cannot be the man who abandoned a dying son and a lifelong friend, so he becomes, in the truest sense, the man who was betrayed by them. Each new cause is a bandage over an old wound, each new speech another layer of denial laid over a memory he cannot face. That is why he keeps seeking underdogs. Native rebels in the north, Mexican revolutionaries in the south, any group that can be framed as victims of civilization. On the surface, this looks idealistic, a continuation of the anti-establishment philosophy from the very beginning, but the pattern reveals something colder. Aligning with the oppressed lets Dutch remain the living embodiment of resistance in his own mind. If the world was changing, if civilization was swallowing the frontier, then he could not simply be an outlaw on the run. He had to be a visionary standing against an empire. Over time, this self-mythologizing turns him into exactly that, a wandering legend. Stories spread of a gray-haired bandit who speaks like a professor and kills without blinking. To drifters and deserters, he appears as a savior, to lawmen, as a ghost. But the more legendary he becomes, the less tethered he is to reality. The dream grows, the man shrinks. So when he finally surfaces again in John Marston's story, he is both entirely familiar and deeply wrong. The voice is the same, the rhetoric is the same, but the center is gone. What happens on those cliffs at Blackwater is the end of a long, desperate flight from the truth. And the next chapter will show what remains of Dutch when the world, at last, corners its lost soul. By the time John Marston rides back into that world, the shape of Dutch's tragedy has already been carved in stone. Yet the government does not care about tragedy. It cares about loose ends. So John is dragged from his hard-won ranch, his wife and son held hostage, and sent to hunt down the men who once called him brother Bill Williamson, Javier Escuela, and looming above them all, Dutch Vanderlinda. On paper, it is a manhunt. In reality, it is a story of a former outlaw being forced to become an instrument of the very civilization Dutch always claimed to oppose. John moves from New Austin to Mexico, tracking Bill and Javier through ruined forts and revolution, watching governments old and new crush whoever stands beneath their boots. Each capture is presented as progress, as service to the state, but each step only leads him closer to the ghost waiting in the mountains. When Dutch finally appears in Red Dead Redemption, he is both changed and eerily the same. He has built another gang from its humble beginnings, this time among native rebels and dispossessed outcasts, preaching resistance against the encroaching federal power. The speeches are familiar, the world was changing, the old ways were dying, and only those willing to fight could remain free. To his followers, he is the living embodiment of defiance. To John, he is a terrible echo of the campfire sermons that once made a scared orphan feel part of a family. Dutch's new cause, on the surface, seems more explicitly political. He arms native fighters, talks of treaties broken and lands stolen, and frames every raid as righteous revenge. But underneath, the pattern is the same as it was with Arthur and Hosea. Grand plans, escalating violence, and a philosophy stretched thinner each time it is tested. Is he really fighting for them, or using them to prove he was always right? For John, every encounter is a reckoning. He is not just chasing a criminal, he is confronting the man who raised him, lied to him, and left him to die. Dutch taunts him from rooftops and cliffs, calling him boy again, mocking his attempts at a quiet life. He slips easily into old roles, the philosopher, the prophet, the wounded patriarch, insisting that John has betrayed their dreams of freedom, that John is the one who changed, not him. In the truest sense, Dutch treats these confrontations as theater. He talks circles around agents and soldiers, warns John that the government will never let him go, and keeps insisting that he is still the only one fighting real tyranny. He cannot win the war, but he can still control the narrative. So when he makes his final stand in the snowy mountains, cornered above a sheer drop, his choice is not about escape. It is about authorship. If the world insists on ending his story, Dutch will decide how the last page is written. Or so he believes, right up until the moment someone else turns that same choice back on John. But the cliff in the mountains is not the end of Dutch's story of repetition. It is the bridge to his final, smaller, and far more desperate experiment. The new gang seen years later in the first Red Dead Redemption, a broken echo of everything he once built from its humble beginnings with Hosea, Arthur, and John. By the time Dutch resurfaces, the world was changing faster than even he could lie to himself about. The old ways were dying, and in their place, he gathers a new band of followers, young, angry, dispossessed men from the reservation and the fringes of encroaching civilization. These are not seasoned outlaws raised on campfire stories of honor and loyalty. They are orphans of conquest, children of broken treaties and burned villages, drawn to him because he speaks the rage they feel but cannot yet articulate. Dutch steps into that void as he always has, the living embodiment of resistance in his own mind, presenting himself as savior, teacher, philosopher. He recycles the same speeches about freedom and corruption he once gave to Arthur and John. The government is a tyrant, civilization is a disease, the meek must rise up and seize their destiny. To these new ears, it sounds radical and new. To anyone who remembers the very beginning, it is a tired sermon delivered with undimmed conviction. Yet the gap between his words and his actions has never been wider. Dutch talks about defending the oppressed, then orders kidnappings that terrorize townsfolk who had nothing to do with the reservation's suffering. He rails against institutional cruelty, then orchestrates bombings and ambushes that kill random civilians and low-level soldiers, people as trapped in the system as his followers. This is rebellion in the truest sense only in his imagination. On the ground, it is chaos dressed up as philosophy. Here the irony turns cruel. The man who once claimed to be fighting for a better world now creates one more dangerous for the very people he claims to defend. Every atrocity brings harsher crackdowns on the reservation, more patrols, more fear. Yet when plans fail, Dutch never looks inward. He blames the government, the Pinkertons, the March of Progress, and above all, John Marston, the former prot turned hound of the state. How convenient is it, psychologically, to turn every consequence of his own choices into proof that his enemies are monsters? This is not growth. It is entrenchment. A dreamer dug into his delusions, an outlaw clinging to a story where betrayal always comes from others. So when Dutch is driven once more to a cliff's edge, facing John instead of Arthur, the choice has already been written. He can surrender and admit that he has become what he always swore he fought, or he can die on his own terms and preserve the myth in his head. He steps off the rock, choosing legend over responsibility, and in doing so passes the burden of truth to those left behind. Dutch's final stand is not in a bank or a battlefield, but on a ledge above a frozen world, the last of the Vanderlinda legend, cornered by the very civilization he spent a lifetime cursing. John Marston climbs toward him, with government rifles at his back, and the past climbs with him. The scene is simple. Dutch stands at the edge of a cliff, his gang gone, his dreams in ruins, a hunted outlaw who has become the living embodiment of everything he claimed to resist. Ross and the agents close in behind John, the cold wind howling through the canyon. It is, in the truest sense, a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, all condensed into one final conversation between teacher and student. Dutch looks at John and sees not just a former proch, but the proof that the world was changing without him. He says, "We can't always fight nature, John. We can't fight change. We can't fight nothing." On its surface, it is resignation, the voice of a man who finally admits the old ways were dying. But beneath that, the philosophy is twisted. Dutch is still casting himself as the tragic prophet who saw too much, a man crushed by forces beyond his control, rather than the architect of his own downfall. When he adds, "Our time is past, John," and talks about America turning into a land of big men in suits, Dutch is both right and wrong. His critique of civilization has always contained a shard of truth, from its humble beginnings in those early campfire speeches. Yet he frames himself as a victim of progress, not as a leader whose paranoia, cruelty, and refusal to change destroyed his family long before the government arrived. Is he confessing or absolving himself? His final choice answers that. Dutch will not surrender, will not be dragged in chains, will not stand in a courtroom and hear his own story told by someone else. So he turns, gives John one last look filled with something between pity and challenge, and steps backward into the void. It is an escape from accountability, but also a last assertion of control. If the world insists on ending his story, he will at least choose the punctuation mark. John's reaction is quiet, but devastating. He rushes to the edge, staring down at the broken body of the man who raised him, who abandoned him, who has now refused even a final honest word. Sorrow, anger, and a bitter kind of closure mix in his eyes. Dutch has died as he lived, on his own terms, and at everyone else's expense. So Dutch's death is not a simple villain's fall. It is the last act of a man who could never admit he was wrong, even to himself, and it leaves a question hanging over John's head that will guide the rest of this story. What does a man do with a legacy built on beautiful words and brutal lies? To answer that hanging question, the story has to step back from bullets and betrayals and look at Dutch himself. Was this man always a monster in waiting, or did the world break him until his dreams hardened into delusions? In other words, was Dutch Vanderlinda born a narcissist, or did tragedy crown him as one? From the very beginning, Dutch's life is a study in resentment. He grows up poor, pushed around, seeing the worst of institutions that claim to bring order and civilization. A drunken, abusive father, a mother who dies too young, authorities that punish the weak and protect the powerful. Those early years teach him two lessons he never forgets. Power is always abused from above, and the only safety lies in never being beneath anyone again. That is where his hatred of government, law, and the encroaching world of railroads and corporations is born. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch decides he will not go quietly with them. Out of that pain, he builds a philosophy of freedom that sounds idealistic on the surface, but underneath carries a hunger for control. If the system is always cruel, then only a man who stands outside it, above it, can be trusted. Clinically, the traits that follow are familiar. Charisma that borders on hypnotic, grandiose speeches about destiny and progress, a constant need to be admired as a visionary, even when plans fail, a refusal to accept fault, turning every setback into betrayal by others. These are the bones of narcissism and the skeleton of a cult leader, and Dutch becomes the living embodiment of both as the years roll on. He gathers vulnerable people around him, runaways, orphans, abused women, disillusioned men, and calls them family. Arthur, taken in as a teenager. John, another lost soul needing a father. Sadie, brutalized by the very civilization Dutch claims to resist. To them he offers not just food and shelter, but meaning. Is it loyalty, or dependence dressed up as freedom? Yet to call him purely cynical from its humble beginnings would be a lie. In the truest sense, early Dutch does care. He protects his gang from overt cruelty, refuses pointless slaughter, and rails against the hanging of innocents. He risks himself to pull Arthur out of danger, grieves when Hosea or Annabelle suffer, and for a time genuinely tries to rob the rich while shielding the weak. The philosophy is not entirely a mask. The tragedy is that his ideals and his ego fuse until they cannot be separated. When Blackwater collapses, when Hosea dies in Saint Denis, when the Pinkertons close in, Dutch's grand plans fail, but his self-image cannot. So the blame shifts outward, to traitors, to Micah's whispers, to a world that never understood him. He lies to the gang, but worse, he lies to himself, rewriting every cruelty as necessity. By the time he leaps from that cliff, Dutch is no longer simply an outlaw leader. He is a man so trapped inside his own story that he cannot see he has become the very thing he hates. And that is what makes his fall, and the legacy John inherits, so haunting. Because if Dutch can convince himself, who in this world is truly safe from their own reflection? If Dutch is a man destroyed by his own reflection, the next question lingers in the smoke he leaves behind. Did the gang have to die with him? Or was there a version of this outlaw family that could have bent with the changing winds instead of breaking? From the very beginning, the Vanderlinda gang is built around a single, blazing center. Dutch is the living embodiment of its dreams and delusions, its philosophy of freedom against civilization, its promise that a band of misfits can stand against the world. That charisma forges loyalty in the truest sense, but it also creates a dangerous dependency. Take away Dutch, change that center, and the entire story of the gang begins to look different. Imagine Hosea in command, not as the quiet counselor behind the throne, but as the one whose word is final. Hosea is a conman and a criminal, but he is also a pragmatist who understands when the odds are bad and the walls are closing in. He is the one who pushes to walk away from doomed jobs, who wants to retire to a small house with Bessie, who sees that the world was changing long before Blackwater. Under Hosea, the gang might have become smaller, less theatrical, more careful, fewer grand speeches, more quiet exits. Arthur, too, grows into someone who could have led a different kind of outfit. His emerging moral compass, sharpened by illness and regret, shifts the gang's center of gravity from spectacle to responsibility. In another life, this is a story of a leaner, more grounded family of outlaws, one that takes smaller scores, avoids unnecessary bloodshed, and values the safety of its own over Dutch's operatic gestures. Arthur is still an outlaw, but his philosophy trends toward mercy, toward seeing each member not as a piece on Dutch's chessboard, but as a life he is responsible for. Even John, reluctant and wounded, represents a possible future. By the time he walks away from Dutch, he is a man caught between freedom and civilization, between the ranch and the gun. A gang under John would probably not last long, but it might die quietly, in a cabin somewhere, instead of in a hail of Pinkerton bullets. Yet the world was changing, and the old ways were dying whether Dutch ranted about it or not. Industrialization, federal power, and the relentless pressure of the Pinkertons meant that large outlaw gangs were living on borrowed time. No leader, however cautious, could permanently outrun telegraphs, railroads, and a government determined to bring order to the frontier. What could change was not the ending, but the body count on the way there. Under Hosea, perhaps Blackwater never happens. Under Arthur, Micah never gains such influence. Under John, the children grow up far from gunfire. The era still closes, but the collapse is quieter, less poisoned by betrayal. Dutch's psychology turns an inevitable decline into an operatic catastrophe, turning every warning into treason and every failure into someone else's fault. The tragedy is not that the gang ends. The tragedy is how it ends. And that ending, in all its blood and fire, is what makes the legacy John carries into Red Dead Redemption so heavy, because the world that comes next is built directly on the ruins Dutch leaves behind. John's burden, though, is not just personal guilt or survivor's remorse. It is the weight of a country trying to decide what kind of story it wants to tell about itself. Because from its humble beginnings, the Vanderlinda gang is more than a band of outlaws. It is the living embodiment of America's contradictions. From the very beginning, Dutch frames the gang as a sanctuary between freedom and civilization. Around the campfire, he speaks of open land, self-reliance, and a world where no man bows to a king or a banker. Yet every camp they build is a tiny, improvised civilization of its own, with chores and rules and hierarchies. The gang dreams of freedom, practices civilization, and survives through outlaw violence. That tension is not an accident. It is the point. Dutch's philosophy is drenched in revolutionary language. He quotes thinkers he half understands, rails against government and capital, calls his robberies reparations for the poor and dispossessed. In the truest sense, he borrows the rhetoric of real-world revolutions, liberty, equality, resistance to tyranny. But the same words that inspire Arthur and sway Javier also give Dutch permission to kill, to torture, to sacrifice his own family in the name of the greater good. How different is that from any leader who wraps personal power in the flag of idealism? The gang's composition makes the metaphor impossible to ignore. Charles, a man of native and African heritage, is a reminder that the old ways were dying long before Dutch ever picked up a gun. Lenny and Tilly, former slaves and children of slavery's shadow, carry the scars of a country built on chains. Sadie Adler, abused widow turned gunslinger, and Abigail, a woman passed around by men before the gang, expose how easily family becomes another word for possession. Javier, Bill, Karen, Mary Beth, all the misfits and lost soul strays, form a cross-section of those crushed under progress. This is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, but also of who gets left behind when the train tracks go through. Across from them stand the Pinkertons and the federal agents. They are not mustache-twirling villains so much as functionaries of an expanding system. Milton does not hate Dutch because of his ideas. He hunts him because there is a file, an order, a paycheck. The government in Red Dead is faceless, procedural, inevitable. It does not have room for Dutch's campfire speeches, but it does not care enough to listen to them either. In that sense, Dutch's fall is only half the story. The other half is a country outgrowing its myths while still needing men like Dutch to tell them. What happens when the frontier closes, but the legend of the frontier refuses to die? The answer lies in the next chapter of this world, where John is forced to live out the consequences of Dutch's dream long after the dreamer himself has vanished into the mountains. Dutch disappears into the snow and the smoke, but the story refuses to end with him. His shadow lingers in ink on a page, in the way a man holds his jaw when he is angry, in the stubborn belief that freedom is still possible in a world that has already decided otherwise. Arthur's journal is the first monument to that shadow. From the very beginning, his sketches and entries treat Dutch as the living embodiment of purpose. A philosopher outlaw, a father, a prophet promising that the gang is more than crime, that it is family and resistance in the truest sense. Early drawings of Dutch are confident, heroic, framed with words about loyalty, dreams, and a better world beyond civilization's reach. Then the handwriting changes. The lines grow shakier, the sketches harsher, the captions edged with doubt. Arthur records Dutch's speeches, but now the praise is interrupted by questions. Why so much blood? Why so many dead? Why does every plan demand another sacrifice? By Beaver Hollow, the journal has become a quiet trial, a story of idealistic faith curdling into clear-eyed rejection. Arthur does not just abandon Dutch, he documents the exact moment he understands that the philosophy was never going to match the man. John reads that record, even if the game never lingers on the scene. The ranch he builds in Red Dead Redemption is an answer to those pages. His decision to haul lumber instead of dynamite, to raise cattle instead of hell, is not just a new life, it is a refusal to repeat Dutch's mistakes. He wants a home, a wife who is not a camp follower, a son who grows up knowing his father's face rather than his legend. But the echoes remain. John is proud, stubborn, allergic to authority. When the government agents push him, when old grudges with Bill and Javier reawaken, he slips back into Dutch's rhythms. The lone outlaw against a corrupt civilization, the man who thinks he can fix everything with one last ride. The narrative frames these moments as dangerous, not romantic. The more John sounds like Dutch, the closer he comes to Dutch's fate. Others carry different fragments of the old gang into the new century. Charles takes the ethic of mutual aid and turns it toward protecting indigenous communities, stripping away Dutch's ego and grandiosity. Sadie keeps the ferocity and the refusal to bow, but she no longer needs a prophet to justify her choices. From its humble beginnings as an outlaw family, the Vanderlinda philosophy is broken apart and rebuilt into smaller, quieter acts of loyalty and decency. In the end, Dutch's true legacy is not only the bodies buried from Blackwater to Beecher's Hope. It is the hard-earned wisdom his survivors drag with them into a harsher, more civilized world, where the old ways were dying but the lessons of their failure still matter. The dreamer falls, yet his broken dream keeps teaching those who outlive him what not to become. And the tragedy is this: to escape Dutch, they must first become enough like him to understand why he had to be left behind. That is the knife twist at the heart of Dutch's story. The realization that escaping him means first walking beside him, sharing his language, sharing his crimes. Red Dead Redemption 2 is built so that this journey is not just observed from a distance. In the truest sense, it is inhabited. From the very beginning, the player stands where Arthur stands, hears what Arthur hears, believes what Arthur believes. The opening hours are a story of dependence and trust. The blizzard in Coulter, the desperate flight from Blackwater, the ragged, freezing camp huddled in the mountains. In that world, Dutch is not yet a mad prophet. He is the living embodiment of leadership under pressure, striding through the snow, promising safety, promising freedom, promising that the gang will endure while the world was changing around them. Who else seems to know what to do? Who else sounds so certain? Then the game slows down. It lets camp life breathe. Around the fire at Horseshoe Overlook and Clemens Point, Dutch tells stories about the old days, jokes with Hosea, dances with Molly, comforts Jack when the boy wakes from nightmares. He praises Arthur's loyalty, defends John's failures as growing pains, and speaks about civilization as a cage closing on honest outlaws. These quiet evenings, the songs, the laughter, the shared meals, they are not filler. They are the emotional mortar that makes later betrayal feel personal. From its humble beginnings in those early chapters, the player's view of Dutch is curated with care. He is framed in warm firelight, surrounded by family, delivering idealistic speeches about equality and dignity. The philosophy sounds noble, the crimes feel targeted. Rob a train owned by Leviticus Cornwall? That seems righteous enough. Shake down some debtors for Strauss? Unpleasant, perhaps, but presented as necessary for the survival of the group. Then the fractures arrive. Missions begin to strip away the romance. Dutch's decision to abandon the innocents on the trolley in Saint Denis, his cold response to the massacre at the Braithwaite Manor, his refusal to save the Wapiti from a war he helped inflame. These are not subtle missteps. They are moments where cruelty is unavoidable, where his plans clearly make no sense, where the rhetoric of freedom collapses into vanity and delusions. The discomfort is deliberate. The same hands that rescue John at Coulter also light the dynamite that kills bystanders. The same gun that defends camp at Shady Bell helps slaughter Angelo Bronte in a fit of theatrical vengeance. Participation becomes complicity. How different is that from Bill, Javier, or even Hosea, who talk themselves into one more job, one more plan, one more chance to prove Dutch right? In the end, Dutch's power as a character comes from this shared descent. It is not simply a case study walked through glass. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, experienced alongside every lost soul in that camp. The next step is to trace how that shared journey shatters, and how Arthur and John finally break from the man who once felt like the only guide through a dying frontier. The shattering of that shared journey reveals what Dutch Vanderlinda truly is. Not just a failed outlaw, but the living embodiment of a dream that refuses to admit it has died. His story stretches from its humble beginnings in a brutal childhood, through the height of his charisma, to the lonely echo of a man standing on a cliff, unable to face the world he helped create. From the very beginning, Dutch is an abused boy who learns that power speaks through fists, guns, and institutions. Beaten by his father, scarred by poverty, he decides that civilization is just a more polite form of cruelty. Out of that wound grows an idealistic philosophy: freedom over authority, loyalty over law, family over blood. With Hosea at his side, he turns that pain into rhetoric, building a roaming community of lost souls who mistake his speeches for salvation. For a time, it almost works. Dutch becomes a beloved father figure, teaching Arthur to read, telling John that the gang is his true family, convincing misfits that their crimes are rebellion, not desperation. This is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, held together by one man's voice. But beneath the charm lies a savior complex. Dutch does not just want to help. He needs to be the one who saves. The one who knows best, the one who is never wrong. Blackwater is where that fantasy collides with reality. The failed ferry robbery, the dead civilians, the shattered plan, all demand that Dutch admit failure. Instead, cognitive dissonance takes over. The problem is not his leadership. It is the government, the Pinkertons, the traitors in his midst. Every setback becomes proof that the world was changing, that the old ways were dying, and only he has the courage to resist. Hosea's death in Saint Denis removes the last person who can quietly challenge that delusion. Without Hosea's restraint, Dutch's paranoia hardens. He scapegoats John as disloyal, clings to Micah's flattery, and drives the gang into Beaver Hollow, where the camp stops feeling like family and starts feeling like a cult. Arthur's confrontation in the mud and blood, coughing and desperate, is the moment Dutch is finally offered a mirror. He turns away. That refusal carries him all the way to the final cliff. In Red Dead Redemption, facing John and the government he always hated, Dutch chooses the one act that preserves his illusion of control. He jumps. He would rather die as a tragic revolutionary than live as a man who was wrong. In the truest sense, Dutch and his gang mirror the larger story of America itself. Noble ideals corrupted by ego, violence justified by beautiful words, progress pursued without counting the bodies left behind. If this is what happens when a man cannot accept responsibility, what happens to a nation built on the same denial? And as this tragedy reaches its end, one question remains open. What lessons are carried forward into other lives, other stories, other desperate quests for freedom? Those lessons are not abstract. They live in memories, in moments, in the precise second when faith in Dutch Vanderlinde finally broke. For some, this story of loyalty and betrayal ends in a single gunshot. For others, it dies slowly, with every hollow promise and every plan that leads deeper into the mud. So the question becomes simple and brutal. When did that trust shatter? Was it back at the very beginning of the end, on the docks of Blackwater, when the plan went wrong before the game even began, and the gang fled a massacre that Dutch never truly explains? Was it the realization that this idealistic outlaw who claimed to fight civilization itself had dragged his own family into a slaughter he could not control? For many, the breaking point arrives in Saint Denis, as Hosea Matthews is dragged before the bank, used as leverage, and executed. Dutch watches his oldest friend, the living embodiment of his better nature, die in front of him. His response is not grief, not reflection, but rage and escalation. Which line cut deepest there? The way he screams that they will rob the city blind, or the emptiness when he tells the survivors that Hosea knew the risks, as if decades of friendship can be written off as a miscalculation? Others hold on longer. They stay with him through Guarma, through the return to a world that was changing faster than his philosophy could keep up. Perhaps the true rupture comes in Beaver Hollow, when Dutch abandons Arthur on that mountainside, choosing Micah's flattery over a dying son's plea for honesty. In that moment, the man who once rescued a lost soul from a rope leaves another to bleed in the dust. Was he ever truly good, or only good at sounding good? Some do not let go until the epilogue, until the cliff above Beecher's Hope. When Dutch steps out of the shadows one last time, he kills Micah, spares John, and mutters that they are all just like him. Do those final words feel like a confession, a last grasp at redemption, or one more attempt to dodge responsibility by dragging everyone down together? Each playthrough rewrites the story. On a first journey, Dutch may appear as tragic mentor turned madman. On later rides, every smile curdles, every speech about freedom sounds rehearsed, every act of mercy feels transactional. Does hindsight reveal a good man who lost his way, or a conman whose mask slowly slipped as the old ways were dying? These answers matter, because they shape how the world of Red Dead Redemption is understood. They decide whether Arthur's doubts, John's escape, Micah's manipulation, and Hosea's warnings, read as isolated moments, or as one long, inevitable collapse. And in the truest sense, they decide which character demands the next deep dive into this broken family's history. In the end, that is what Dutch's tale becomes. A question that keeps echoing long after the guns fall silent. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, a family forged in desperation and scattered across a changing world. From its humble beginnings in backroom cons and small-town robberies to the grand tragedy of Saint Denis, Beaver Hollow, and that cliff above the Mexican border, the Vanderlinda gang stands as the living embodiment of a dying frontier. At the very beginning, it is a campfire philosophy about freedom, about resisting a cruel civilization, about giving lost souls a home. By the end, it is a trail of bodies, broken promises, and a man who can no longer recognize the face in the mirror. The themes that framed this saga at the start return now, heavier and more complicated. Idealism versus reality is no longer an abstract tension. It is Dutch insisting that Blackwater was a setup rather than a mistake, that Guarma is an opportunity rather than a nightmare, that Hosea's death is treachery rather than consequence. Freedom versus civilization becomes less a noble stand and more a refusal to accept that the world was changing, that the old ways were dying, and that clinging to the past can destroy the very family built to survive it. This is, in the truest sense, a story of found family turned tragic legend. Dutch gathers Arthur, John, Sadie, Charles, and the rest under a banner of belonging, only to let paranoia and wounded pride poison every bond. Hosea's quiet doubts, Arthur's journal, John's escape, even Micah's smug manipulation, all reveal different angles of one collapsing mind. What began as a camp of misfits dreaming of freedom ends as a cautionary myth whispered in saloons and Pinkerton offices alike. For those still sitting at this metaphorical campfire, listening to the last embers of the tale, there is another kind of choice. remain a passerby, or ride along with others who care about deep, character-driven storytelling, who see these outlaws not just as targets on a minimap, but as case studies in hope, fear, and self-destruction. Joining this ongoing journey means adding a voice, sharing this story, subscribing to the larger chronicle, keeping this broken family's history alive as the series rides on. Because this is only one angle. Dutch's psychology is one thread in a wider tapestry. Arthur's moral awakening, John's reluctant redemption, the Pinkertons' cold machinery of law and profit, even the nameless towns and reservations caught in the crossfire, each demand their own complete exploration. What did this philosophy do to Arthur's soul? How did John carry these scars into his own doomed homestead? What did the agents hunting them tell themselves to sleep at night? Picture the final image. The camp is empty now. Bedrolls abandoned, wagons gone, only a circle of blackened stones where the fire once roared with speeches about freedom and destiny. Horses graze in the distance, saddles removed, as if the land itself is taking a breath. Smoke drifts upward from the last faint ember. And on the wind, barely more than a memory, Dutch's voice lingers one last time. I have a plan. Then the ember dies. The sound fades. Cut to black. The next legend waits in the dark.